Eleanor Whitmore did not cry when they made her kneel. She had learned long ago that tears only gave cruel people satisfaction. So when Lady Margaret pointed to the cold marble floor and said lower, Eleanor obeyed. She lowered herself until her knees touched stone. Until the room full of silk gowns and silver rings watched her in silence, and she told herself, "Do not break, do not break, do not break." She didn't know that the man standing in the doorway had already decided she never would again. If this story moves you, subscribe. Stay until the end and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far Eleanor's story travels. The summer of 1812 was the hottest Virginia had seen in 20 years. That was what people said anyway. Eleanor Whitmore had heard it twice already, once from the driver who picked her up at the crossroads 3 miles outside of town, and once from the stable boy who took her single bag without looking at her face. She didn't think about the heat. She thought about the letter folded inside her left glove. It had arrived 11 days ago at the small white church where her father served as pastor. The seal on the envelope was deep blue wax with the letter C pressed into the center. Caldwell. Everyone in Harrow County knew that seal. Everyone in 3 counties knew it. The letter had been short, direct, written in a hand that did not waste ink on softness. Miss Whitmore, your name has come to my attention in connection with the matter of my late husband's estate. Your presence is required at Caldwell Manor no later than the 14th of July. You will be evaluated and a decision made. Transportation will be arranged. Lady Margaret Caldwell. No greeting, no explanation, no warmth. Eleanor had read it 4 times before she understood what it meant. Nathaniel Caldwell's father, the late Mr. Thomas Caldwell, had apparently made a provision in his will. Something about a young woman of good character serving as a companion and secretary to the Caldwell household during the period of estate transition. Her father's name had been given as a reference. Reverend Whitmore had connections to the elder Caldwell through years of quiet charity work. The Reverend had apparently mentioned his daughter. Her father had not warned her. He had only pressed her hands and said, "Go with your whole heart, Eleanor, and do not let anyone take it from you." She had promised. She was beginning to wonder if she understood what that promise would cost. The carriage turned through iron gates, and Eleanor got her first real look at Caldwell Manor. It sat at the top of a long, sloping drive, lined with oak trees so old their roots had broken through the earth on both sides. The house itself was white columns, white stone steps, white window frames against a brick face that had faded to the color of dried clay. It was enormous in the way that old money was always enormous. Not showy, not loud. Just there, settled into the Virginia hillside like it had always existed and always would long after everyone inside it was gone. A man in a dark coat stood waiting at the foot of the steps. He did not smile when the carriage stopped. "Miss Whitmore," he said, opening the door. He did not offer his hand. "Lady Margaret is expecting you in the drawing room." "Thank you," Eleanor said. He said nothing back. She stepped down onto the stone pathway and adjusted the collar of her blue dress. The best one she owned, pressed the night before with care, still simple, still clearly not expensive, and she followed him inside. The entrance hall smelled like beeswax and cut flowers and something older beneath both. Money had a smell, Eleanor was learning. It was the smell of things that had never been worried about. She heard voices before she reached the drawing room. Women's voices. Several of them low and ornamented, the kind of voices that had been trained to carry authority without raising in pitch. The servant opened the double doors. Eleanor walked in. There were 8 women seated around the large room, arranged on settees and chairs, with the practiced ease of people who had never once considered whether they belonged somewhere. Crystal glasses, embroidered fans, silk in 3 different colors. One woman had a small dog on her lap. Another wore a brooch at her throat that probably cost more than Eleanor's father earned in 2 years. At the center of it all sat Lady Margaret Caldwell. Eleanor recognized her immediately, though she had never seen her before. It was the way she held herself, straight-backed, still. Her silver hair pinned under a dark cap. her hands folded in her lap like two closed books. She was perhaps 58. Her face was not unkind in its basic structure. High cheekbones, sharp jaw, dark eyes that had probably been striking once. But there was something in her expression that had been set hard by years of deciding things. She was the kind of woman who had made up her mind about Eleanor Whitmore before Eleanor walked through the door. Eleanor stopped at the appropriate distance and inclined her head. "Lady Margaret, thank you for the invitation to—" "So this is Reverend Whitmore's daughter." It was not a question. It was not a greeting. It was the kind of statement that was meant to establish something before anything else could be said. The other women turned to look. Not discreetly, openly. Eleanor kept her chin level. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret's eyes moved over her with the slow deliberation of someone appraising livestock at market. The dress, the shoes, the single bag, the hands, the posture. "You've traveled 2 days." "Yes, ma'am." "You brought one case." "It contains what I need." A small pause. One of the women near the window exchanged a look with her neighbor. "Your father wrote to my late husband," Margaret said. "He described you as a woman of considerable education and strong character." "My father has always been generous." "He also described you as humble." Margaret tilted her head slightly. "I wonder if that is true." Eleanor said nothing. She understood already that this was a test. She just didn't yet know exactly what kind. "Tell me, Miss Whitmore," Margaret continued, "do you understand the household you are being considered for? The position you would occupy? I understand I would serve as companion and secretary during the transition period of the estate. I would assist with correspondence record-keeping and such social duties as might be required of me." "That is the duty," Margaret said. "I asked about the household." Another pause. "I understand it is the most respected in the county," Eleanor said carefully. "I understand there is a standard expected here that goes beyond work." Margaret smiled then. It was a small smile, not warm. "Good," she said. "Then you already understand that how a person carries themselves in this house matters as much as what they can do." "I do." "Show me your curtsy." The room shifted slightly, not physically, but Eleanor felt it the attention of 8 women sharpening to a single point, all of it aimed at her. She gathered her skirts and lowered herself. It was a proper curtsy, graceful, correct. Her mother had made sure of that years before she died. Margaret studied it. "Lower," she said. The word landed in the silence like a stone into still water. Eleanor held the position she was in for one breath. Then she sank deeper. "Lower!" One of the women near the door looked down at her fan. Another coughed softly. The dog on the third woman's lap lifted its head. Lower. Eleanor felt the strain in her knees, felt the floor through the thin sole of her shoe. Felt something else too. Something hot and sharp beginning to rise in her chest that she had a great deal of practice keeping down. She went lower. "One more time," Margaret said, and Eleanor heard it then, not cruelty exactly. Something colder than cruelty. This was assessment. This was a woman finding out exactly how far a poor girl would bend before she broke. Finding out what she was made of by trying to unmake her. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the fabric of her skirt. "Do not break." She lowered herself one final time, until her right knee touched the marble floor. The room went utterly still. Not one woman moved. Not one breath came too loud. Even the dog went quiet. Eleanor stared at the marble beneath her knee. White stone, cold even in summer. She could feel her own heartbeat against it. Do not break. Do not break. Do not. Enough. The voice came from behind her. Low. Direct. Not loud, but the kind of voice that did not need to be loud because rooms reorganized themselves around it without being asked. Eleanor heard the footsteps. Measured. Unhurried. Crossing the room without pausing. Then a hand appeared in front of her. Large. Weathered at the knuckles. A man's hand extended downward with the straightforward simplicity of someone who had decided something and was now simply executing it. Eleanor looked up. He was not what she had expected. She had built a picture of Nathaniel Caldwell from fragments the county's stories. Her father's careful descriptions, the way people's voices changed slightly when they said his name. She had expected someone polished, formal, the way a man raised in a house like this would be. He was not polished. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with a jaw that had not been shaved this morning, and dark hair that was damp at the edges from rain. His coat was good quality, but marked with road dust on both sleeves. His boots were not clean. He had the look of a man who had ridden hard and arrived here without stopping to make himself presentable first, and who was not particularly concerned about that. His eyes were dark gray, and they were not looking at his mother. They were looking at Eleanor. "Take my hand, Miss Whitmore," he said quietly. She did. He lifted her to her feet as though she weighed nothing. He did not release her hand immediately. He turned, still holding it, to face the room. "Miss Whitmore has traveled 2 days at this family's request," he said. His voice was even, controlled, but Eleanor could hear something underneath the control, something that had a temperature to it. "She is a guest of this house. Nathaniel." Margaret's voice carried a warning. He didn't turn toward her. "We do not ask guests to perform for us, Mother. I was simply... I know what you were doing." Now he did look at her, just briefly. "It won't happen again." The silence that followed was the particular kind that Eleanor recognized from her father's church, the silence after something has been said that cannot be unsaid when the whole room is adjusting to the new shape of things. Margaret did not respond. Nathaniel turned back to Eleanor. He released her hand. He stepped slightly to the side, not behind her, but beside her, positioning himself in a way that made it clear without words that she was standing here with him, and not alone. "You must be tired," he said to Eleanor. His voice had changed, not warmer exactly, but more direct, less formal. Like he had stopped performing something and started simply speaking. "Mrs. Hartley will show you to your room. You can rest before dinner if you need to." "Thank you," Eleanor said. She meant it in more ways than one. He nodded once. Then he looked at the housekeeper near the door. "Mrs. Hartley." "Yes, sir." The older woman stepped forward immediately, relief visible on her face. "Right this way, Miss Whitmore." Eleanor followed her. She did not look back at Margaret. She did not look back at the women on the settees. But as she passed through the doorway, she heard Margaret say very quietly to the room, or perhaps only to herself, "This will be a problem." Her room was on the second floor at the end of the east corridor. It was smaller than the rooms she had glimpsed along the way, but it was clean and well furnished. A narrow bed with a white coverlet, a writing desk beneath the window, a small fireplace that was unlit in the summer heat, and a view of the kitchen garden below. Mrs. Hartley set her bag down near the wardrobe and turned with the expression of someone who had something to say and was deciding whether to say it. Eleanor saved her the trouble. "Is it always like that?" she asked. Mrs. Hartley considered the question for a moment. "Lady Margaret has very particular ideas about who belongs here," she said finally. "It isn't personal, miss." It felt personal. "Yes." A pause. "I suppose it would." She moved toward the door, then stopped. "Mr. Nathaniel has been running the estate since his father passed 8 months ago. He doesn't often come back to the manor midday. He happened to arrive at an unfortunate moment." Eleanor looked at her. "Or a fortunate one." Mrs. Hartley's expression shifted slightly, almost a smile. "I'll send up water for washing. Dinner is at 7. She left. Eleanor sat down on the edge of the bed and pressed both hands flat against her knees. Her right knee still ached from the stone. She did not let herself feel the humiliation of it. Not yet. Not here in a stranger's house, where any sound she made might carry through thin walls. Later, maybe, when she was home. If she went home. She pulled the letter from inside her glove and read it again. "Your presence is required. You will be evaluated. A decision will be made." She had been evaluated all right. She folded the letter and set it on the writing desk. Then she stood, went to the window, and looked out at the kitchen garden. A man was working in the far corner of it, young, maybe 16, pulling weeds with the slow patience of someone who had been at it for hours. His shoulders were hunched against the heat. As Eleanor watched, he stopped, reached into his pocket, pulled out a small piece of bread and ate it in 4 bites. Then he went back to work. Something about that, the smallness of it, the plainness of it, settled something in Eleanor's chest. She was here. She had not broken. She would not. Dinner that evening was not the confrontation Eleanor expected. It was something stranger than that. There were 8 at the table. Margaret, Eleanor, Nathaniel, 2 of Margaret's friends who had stayed for the meal, and 3 distant Caldwell relations who were apparently in the process of visiting for the summer. A cousin named Albert, who talked constantly about horse breeding. A young woman named Charlotte, who was clearly being positioned as a potential match for Nathaniel and was pretending not to know it. And Charlotte's mother, who was very obviously ensuring everyone noticed her daughter at every possible moment. Nathaniel sat at the head of the table. He had changed out of his road-dusty coat. He was in a dark jacket now, properly presented. But he still had the air of a man who would rather be somewhere else, not rudely so, not obviously, but in the slight tension around his eyes, and the measured way he answered questions, as though he was rationing words. Eleanor sat near the far end of the table between Mrs. Hartley's empty chair and Albert the cousin. Albert had opinions about horses, many opinions, all of them delivered directly at Eleanor, who he seemed to have decided was a good audience because she was quiet and unlikely to argue. She listened. She asked 1 or 2 questions that were polite but genuine. She ate her food carefully, conscious of the table manners her mother had drilled into her as a child, and she tried very hard not to look at the head of the table. She failed occasionally. Nathaniel caught her once. He was speaking to Charlotte's mother about something related to the harvest schedule, and he glanced down the table, a brief, almost mechanical survey of the room, and his eyes landed on Eleanor for exactly 3 seconds. She looked away first. She was not sure why. After dinner, the women moved to the sitting room, while the men remained for a time with brandy and presumably more conversation about horses. Margaret did not speak to Eleanor directly. She spoke about her to the other women, the Reverend's daughter she called her, in a tone that was technically neutral, but functioned like a category rather than a name. Charlotte sat beside Eleanor on the small sofa near the window. "Are you truly here about Thomas Caldwell's will?" Charlotte asked low enough that the others couldn't hear. "I believe so," Eleanor said. "Do you know what the provision says? Specifically?" "Not entirely. I know there's a position being offered." Charlotte looked at her with an expression that was not quite friendly, but was at least honest. "I've known Nathaniel since we were children," she said. "He isn't cruel. You should know that. Whatever happened today, that was my Aunt Margaret, not him." Eleanor considered this. "Your aunt. By marriage, not blood." Charlotte lowered her voice further. "She means well. She truly does. She's terrified of this estate being mishandled. Thomas's death, it changed things. She's been trying to hold everything in place since then. By testing the people who come through her door." "By testing everyone," Charlotte said, "including me." A pause. "I'm sorry about what happened in the drawing room," Charlotte added. Then she stood because Margaret was looking their way. "I hope you stay." She moved back to her mother's side. Eleanor looked down at her hands. That night she couldn't sleep. The heat was part of it. The second-floor room held warmth, even with the window open, and the night air coming off the Virginia hills was barely cooler than the day. But it wasn't only that. She lay on her back, staring at the ceiling, and turned the day over in her mind. The curtsy, the marble floor, the 8 women watching. Lower, lower, lower. And then the hand. She had not asked for it. She had not even seen him coming. One moment she was kneeling on cold stone, and the next there was a hand in front of her, offered with the uncomplicated certainty of someone who had made up his mind. We do not ask honorable people to kneel. She thought about what Charlotte had said. He isn't cruel. No, Eleanor thought. He wasn't. That almost made it worse. Cruel was manageable. Cruel was something you could hold at arm's length and be angry at. Cruel was something you could build walls against. Kindness offered by a man whose mother had just put your knee to marble that was harder to know what to do with. She turned onto her side. Through the window she could see the edge of the oak-lined drive, and just at the far end of it, a light in what she thought might be the study or the library, one window glowing amber in the dark. She watched it for a while. Then she closed her eyes. The next morning came in loud. Not loudly. Caldwell Manor was too well run for actual noise, but with a kind of density of activity that filled every corridor. Servants moving, doors opening and closing, the smell of bread from the kitchen below. Eleanor dressed early before anyone came to check on her and went downstairs. She wasn't sure where she was going. She followed the smell of bread. The kitchen was at the back of the house, through a narrow hallway that connected the formal rooms to the working ones. The cook, a heavy-set woman named Ida, who Eleanor would later learn had been with the Caldwells for 30 years, looked up when Eleanor appeared in the doorway and stopped what she was doing. "Miss," she said. "Good morning," Eleanor said. "I'm sorry to come in uninvited. I wasn't sure where breakfast. We don't usually serve until 8, Ida said. She was looking at Eleanor with the particular assessment of someone who was deciding something. "But there's bread if you want some, and coffee." "That would be very kind." Ida cut 2 thick slices and poured a mug without being asked twice, and Eleanor sat at the small table near the kitchen garden window, the same view as her room above, and ate her bread and watched the morning light come through the glass. "You're the Reverend's daughter," Ida said from the other side of the room. She wasn't asking. "Yes." A pause. The sound of something being stirred. "Mr. Thomas spoke well of your father. Good man." "He was. Is," Eleanor corrected herself. "He is." Ida made a sound that might have been agreement. "Lady Margaret spoke to you yesterday," Ida said. It was not a question either. "She did. Don't judge her too harshly." Ida's back was still to her. She lost her husband 8 months ago, and she's been trying to keep this whole thing from falling apart by herself. Mr. Nathaniel is good. He's a good man, but he's been running the land and the business and the legal work all at once, and she's been running everything else. "That sounds exhausting," Eleanor said. "It is." Ida turned then briefly. "She's scared is what she is. Women like that, when they're scared, they get hard. It's the only thing they know how to do." Eleanor looked at her bread. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I'm not telling you to forgive her," Ida said firmly. "I'm telling you so you understand what you're walking into." She found the library herself around 9 in the morning. No one had shown it to her. She had simply followed the corridor that felt most like the kind of corridor that would lead somewhere she could think. And there it was, a large room along the south side of the house, floor-to-ceiling shelves on 3 walls, a pair of windows that let in the morning light at a perfect angle, and a smell that made Eleanor stop in the doorway and simply breathe for a moment. Books, old paper, leather binding, the particular dust of a room that had been loved and used for a long time. She stepped inside. She was reaching for the spine of a volume on the second shelf, Thomas Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia, which she had read once and wanted to read again when she heard a sound behind her. She turned. Nathaniel Caldwell was standing at the other end of the room. He had a ledger open in front of him on the reading table. He was in his shirt sleeves, no jacket collar open at the top button, and he was looking at her with the expression of a man who had been interrupted in something and was working out how he felt about it. Eleanor pulled her hand back from the shelf. "I'm sorry," she said immediately. "I didn't know anyone was in here. You don't need to leave." She stopped. He looked back down at the ledger. "I've been here since 6. I'll need another hour at least." I won't disturb you. I know. He turned a page. Take whatever you want off the shelves. She stood for a moment uncertain. Then she turned back to the shelf and took the Jefferson. She settled in the chair farthest from his table near the south window and opened the book. For nearly an hour, they sat in the same room without speaking. It was not uncomfortable. That surprised her. At 10 minutes past 10, Nathaniel closed his ledger. Eleanor heard it, but kept her eyes on her page. You're the first person to use that library since my father died, he said. She looked up. He was still at the table, but he'd pushed the ledger aside and was looking at her. Not with intensity, not the way the women in the drawing room had looked at her assessing her place in the order of things. Just looking. I'm sorry about your father, she said. You didn't know him. No, but you did. That's enough. A beat. My father spoke well of yours, Nathaniel said. Reverend Whitmore. He said he was the kind of man who treated everyone as though they deserved his full attention, regardless of their standing. That's the most accurate description of him I've heard from someone outside the family, Eleanor said. Something shifted very slightly in Nathaniel's expression. Not a smile, but the possibility of one somewhere behind the careful neutrality he wore. What did you think of yesterday? He said. Eleanor considered. Which part? Any of it. She set the book down in her lap. I think your mother is doing what she believes is right for this family, she said. I don't think she's a cruel person. I think she's a frightened one. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. That's a generous interpretation. It's an honest one, Eleanor said. I've been thinking about it since last night. If I were in her position, if I had spent 30 years building something, and then the person I built it with was gone, and I had one son who was carrying the whole weight of it, I think I might also test every person who came through my door. She made you kneel on a marble floor. Yes. Eleanor held his gaze. And then you lifted me up. I haven't forgotten either part. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood, straightened his jacket, and picked up the ledger. Dinner is at 7, he said. Mrs. Hartley will explain your duties this afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. He stopped at the door. Nathaniel, he said without turning around. If you're going to be in this house, there's no reason for formality in private. Then he left. Eleanor looked at the empty doorway for a moment. Then she opened her book again. She didn't read a single word for the next 10 minutes. Mrs. Hartley explained the position over tea in the small sitting room off the kitchen. The duties were what Eleanor had expected correspondence primarily. The late Mr. Thomas Caldwell had left behind a significant backlog of unanswered letters related to the estate tenant agreements, charitable arrangements, and a complicated legal situation involving a parcel of land in the northern end of the county. There was also the matter of the household accounts, which had been managed by Margaret, but were in some disarray since her husband's death. Lady Margaret knows figures, Mrs. Hartley said with the tone of someone being scrupulously fair. But she doesn't enjoy them. Mr. Thomas always handled that side. I do enjoy them, Eleanor said. Mrs. Hartley looked at her with surprise that she only partially suppressed. Your father taught you. My father taught me everything he could, and then I kept reading. The housekeeper made a note. There are also, well, this isn't formally part of the position, but Mr. Nathaniel has mentioned it, there are children in the tenant cottages who have no access to schooling. He has expressed an interest in changing that. Nothing official yet, but he asked me to mention it to you. Eleanor set down her tea. He asked you to mention it to me specifically. Mrs. Hartley met her eyes. He seems to have formed some early impressions. Eleanor wasn't sure what to do with that. She chose to do nothing with it for now and simply said, Tell him I'm interested. She met the Caldwell land that afternoon. Not intentionally. She had gone for a walk along the edge of the kitchen garden after her meeting with Mrs. Hartley, needing air, needing the specific kind of quiet that only open space provided. And she had kept walking farther than she'd planned. following the dirt path between the garden and the tree line until it curved and widened into a view of the lower fields. The summer wheat was nearly chest-high. It moved in the light wind off the hills, like something alive and breathing, and the late afternoon sun came across it at an angle that turned it bronze and gold. And Eleanor stopped and simply stood and looked at it. She had grown up in a small town. She knew farmland. But this was the scale of it, the depth of it, the sense of a whole world that existed alongside the marble halls and silk dresses and silver-ringed hands. It's bigger than it looks from the house. She turned sharply. Nathaniel was standing perhaps 20 feet away at the edge of the path. He had been coming from the direction of the fields and had apparently nearly walked into her. He did not seem startled. He seemed like a man who had long since trained startlement out of himself. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said. "I've wandered too far." "This is still estate land," he said. "You're allowed to walk on it." He came to stand beside her. Not beside her exactly. Some feet away at the respectful distance propriety required, and he looked out at the wheat the same way she had been looking at it. "My father planted the first crop here himself," he said, 40 years ago, before the house was what it is now." "What was it then?" "Smaller, less formal." A pause. "Warmer." Eleanor looked at him. He was watching the wheat and didn't notice or didn't choose to acknowledge it. "Do you like farming?" she asked. He seemed to find the question unexpected. "I don't think I've ever been asked that." "You live on a farm." "I live on an estate. People who live on estates don't usually get asked if they like farming." "You're avoiding the question." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said finally. "I like it. I like the straightforwardness of it. The land tells you the truth. Either the soil is right or it isn't. Either the water is coming or it isn't. There's less performance. Unlike the drawing room." He glanced at her then. Quick. "Unlike many things." She turned back to the wheat. "Mr. Caldwell." "Nathaniel." "Nathaniel." She said it carefully. "What exactly did your father's will say about this position? The letter I received was not very specific." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. "My father believed," he said slowly, "that this estate had become too focused on preserving itself and not enough on the people who depended on it. The tenants, the families in the county. He wanted to change that. He put a provision in his will that for a period of 2 years, an outside person, someone of good character, but not of the gentry, would be brought in to assist with the estate's transition, as a kind of check on the process. A check on you, on all of us." He turned to look at her fully. "On whether we could conduct ourselves with fairness to people who didn't share our advantages." Eleanor took that in. "And your mother," she said. "Does she know this?" "She knows. She doesn't agree with it." He looked away again. "She believed my father was romanticizing, being sentimental." Was I what? Were you angry when you read the will?" Another long pause. "I was," he said. "At first." He pushed his hands into his coat pockets. "And then I went out and talked to James Whitfield. He's a tenant family, been on the south end of the property for 15 years, and I found out his son had been sick all winter, and he hadn't told anyone because he was afraid it would affect their agreement, and I realized my father was right." Eleanor was quiet. "My father was almost always right," Nathaniel said with the weariness of someone who had spent years discovering this. "I've been slowly learning to accept it." The sun had dropped further toward the tree line. The wheat had gone from gold to something deeper. "Thank you for telling me," Eleanor said. "It seemed like something you should know." He turned back toward the path. "Don't stay out too long. The insects off the river come up at dusk, and they're unforgiving." He walked back towards the manor. Eleanor stood a moment longer in the fading light and looked at the wheat. "The land tells you the truth," he had said. She thought about that for a long time. The days began to form a pattern. Early breakfast in the kitchen with Ida's bread and strong coffee. Work through the morning in the small office off the library. Letters accounts the careful mapping of the estate's complicated paper record. Lunch usually brief taken wherever she happened to be working. Afternoon duties that varied, sometimes correspondence with tenants, sometimes household logistics with Mrs. Hartley, sometimes twice in the first week, accompanying Nathaniel on his rounds of the property while he conducted business, and she took notes. It was during those rounds that she began to understand him. He was direct with the tenants, not brusque. He knew their names, knew their children's names, knew the history of each family's connection to the estate. But he did not linger. He didn't make small talk for its own sake. He asked specific questions, listened to the answers, made specific decisions. The tenants trusted him, not with the nervous deference of people who feared the landowner, but with something more solid, the trust of people who had learned that this particular landowner would do what he said. "James Whitfield's son," Eleanor said one afternoon as they walked back from the East Cottages. "You mentioned him the other day. How is he now?" Nathaniel glanced at her. "Better. Dr. Marsh came out last month." "At whose arrangement?" "Mine." "Did you tell James?" "Tell him what?" "That you arranged it." Nathaniel frowned slightly, as though the question was strange. "No, he didn't need to know that." Eleanor looked at the road ahead. Some people, she said, would have let him know, so he'd feel indebted. Some people, Nathaniel said evenly, use every kindness as a coin they expect to collect on later. I find that exhausting. She didn't say anything to that. She wrote it down that night in her journal instead, and underlined it twice. Margaret did not warm to her. That was perhaps too strong. Margaret did not continue to actively challenge her. The drawing room incident was not repeated. At dinners, at morning gatherings, at the social calls that were a constant feature of life at Caldwell Manor, Margaret was civil. Correct. She called Eleanor Miss Whitmore with a precision that was neither warm nor hostile, but she watched. Eleanor felt it constantly. The watching, the measuring, the quiet ongoing calculation of whether Eleanor Whitmore was a threat or an inconvenience or something else entirely. She understood it. She didn't like it, but she understood it. Charlotte came to call twice in the first 2 weeks. The second time she found Eleanor alone in the library and pulled the door mostly shut behind her before speaking. "She's going to try something," Charlotte said without preamble. Eleanor looked up from the letter she was drafting. "Lady Margaret, she's hosting a large gathering, 3 weeks from now. People from Richmond, from Williamsburg. Everyone who matters in Virginia society will be here." Charlotte sat down across from her. "She wants to use it to introduce Mr. Nathaniel to several suitable young women." Eleanor set her pen down. "I'm aware of the gathering. I've been helping organize it." "Then you're aware of the guest list?" "Some of it." "Then you know that she's planning to use the occasion to make a very clear public statement about who belongs in this family and who doesn't." Eleanor was quiet. "I'm telling you," Charlotte said, "because I think you deserve to know what you're walking into. Not so you run, so you're prepared." "What do you think she'll do?" Charlotte looked at her steadily. "Whatever she believes will be most effective." Eleanor looked down at the letter in front of her. "Your presence is required. You will be evaluated. A decision will be made." She had been evaluated for 3 weeks now. She was beginning to understand that the evaluation had never really stopped. "Thank you, Charlotte," she said. Charlotte nodded once and stood. "He'll choose her," she said quietly at the door. "Whatever she plans, Nathaniel will choose correctly. I've known him long enough to know that." A pause. "The question is whether you can hold on until he does." She left. Eleanor sat for a moment in the empty library. Then she picked up her pen. She had 6 more letters to draft before dinner. She would hold on. She had promised her father she would go with her whole heart. She had not promised it would be easy. The evening before the gathering, Nathaniel found her in the kitchen garden. She had come out after the household was quiet, 11, maybe half past, because she couldn't sleep, and the walls of the manor had started to feel like they were measuring the distance between who she was and who this house had decided she should be. She was sitting on the low stone bench near the herb beds, with her father's Bible in her lap, not reading it, just holding it the way she sometimes did when she needed something solid. She heard his boots on the garden path before she saw him. He stopped when he saw her. "I didn't know you were out here," he said. "I couldn't sleep." He stood there for a moment, and she thought he might leave. Instead, he came and sat on the bench. Not close, 2 feet between them, the proper distance, but on the bench. Beside her. He looked at the dark garden. She looked at it too. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" he asked. "I've organized most of it," she said. "The flowers are arranged, the table is set for 40, the musicians confirmed." "I think it's ready." "That isn't what I asked." She glanced at him. He was still looking at the garden. "Charlotte told you what she told me?" Eleanor said. "Charlotte told me what she told you," he confirmed. She took a breath. "I'm not afraid of your mother, Nathaniel. I know you're not." He turned his head and looked at her. In the dark, his face was harder to read, but she had been learning its shapes. "I want you to know that whatever happens tomorrow, whatever my mother does or says, it doesn't change anything I've decided." Eleanor looked at him carefully. "What have you decided?" He held her gaze for one long moment. "That some things matter more than what the room thinks," he said. Then he stood. "Get some sleep, Miss Whitmore," he said, and the formality of it, the slight return to distance, felt like something deliberate. A door closed carefully, rather than slammed. "Good night, Nathaniel," she said. He walked back toward the house. Eleanor stayed on the bench until the lamp in the library window went dark. Then she went inside. Tomorrow was coming one way or another, and Eleanor Grace Whitmore had never yet walked away from something just because it was hard. Normal. The gathering was 3 weeks in the making. 200 candles, 40 guests. The finest crystal the Caldwell cellars could provide. And Margaret had one final test planned. One Eleanor did not see coming. The gathering began the way all great performances began, with music. 3 musicians in the east corner of the ballroom, playing something light and European that floated through the hall and made everyone feel for a moment like they were somewhere more important than they actually were. The candles were lit. The crystal caught the light. The ladies had spent the better part of the afternoon upstairs perfecting their appearances, and the men had spent roughly 15 minutes on theirs and felt good about that. Eleanor stood near the far wall and watched the room fill. She had spent 3 weeks helping build this evening. She knew where every table was. She knew which flowers had been cut from which part of the garden. She knew that the cook had been up since 4 in the morning, and that the musicians had arrived late, and that the third candelabra from the left had a candle that was going to need replacing before 9 o'clock because she had noticed it burning unevenly at setup. What she had not known, what no amount of organizational detail could have prepared her for, was how it would feel to stand in the room she had prepared and know with quiet certainty that she was the only person in it who did not belong. Not because anyone said it, because no one needed to. The women in silk and the men in their pressed jackets moved through the room with the ease of people who had been moving through rooms like this their entire lives. They greeted each other with first names and old jokes, and the particular warmth of people who shared a world. Eleanor watched them and kept her expression pleasant and her posture straight, and thought about something Ida had said to her that morning in the kitchen. "Keep your chin up and your hands still," Ida had said without looking up from the pastry she was shaping. "Still hands, say you're not afraid, even when you are." Eleanor's hands were very still. Margaret entered at 8 o'clock. She wore dark blue, deep, formal, perfectly fitted, and she moved through the room like a ship entering harbor, unhurried and inevitable. People came to her. She did not go to them. She smiled. She was gracious. She touched the arm of a woman from Richmond. She laughed at something a man from Williamsburg said. She presented herself as exactly what she was. The woman who ran this house. Who had always run this house, who would run this house long after everyone who doubted her had been quietly corrected. She passed Eleanor without a word. Eleanor dipped her head politely. Margaret's eyes moved over her like she was part of the furniture. Nathaniel appeared at 8:30. He had been out on the property until late afternoon. Eleanor had seen him come in through the kitchen entrance, dust on his coat, the set of his jaw suggesting the kind of day that resolves problems by creating new ones, and he had clearly dressed quickly. His jacket was correct. His cravat was straight. But there was something about the way he stood in the doorway for a moment scanning the room before entering it that was very much the man from the wheat fields rather than the heir of Caldwell Manor. His eyes found Eleanor almost immediately. She wasn't sure if that meant something or if she was reading intention into coincidence, which was a habit she was trying to correct in herself. He crossed the room without stopping to talk to anyone, which Eleanor noticed several people noticing. "How is it going?" he said quietly, stopping beside her. "Well, I think. The food is ready, the musicians are on their third rotation, and the candle situation has been managed." He looked at her sideways. The candle situation. Third from the left was going to be a problem. I had it swapped at 6. Something moved in his expression that was not quite a smile, but was its first cousin. "I see you've been attending to the important matters." Someone had to. He was quiet a moment, both of them watching the room. "My mother has spoken to 3 women from Richmond in the last hour," he said. "All of them have daughters between 19 and 24. I noticed." "Did you also notice which daughter she's been spending the most time steering in my direction?" Eleanor glanced across the room. A girl in pale yellow pretty, composed with the careful poise of someone trained to it from childhood, was standing near the piano with her mother, both of them angled just slightly toward where Nathaniel was standing, as if they had calculated the geometry of it in advance. "The one in yellow," Eleanor said. "Miss Harriet Beaumont," Nathaniel confirmed. "Her family has land in Williamsburg. Good family, old money, excellent match by every conventional measure." Eleanor said nothing. "She plays piano beautifully," Nathaniel continued in the tone of a man reciting facts that are technically accurate and completely irrelevant. "Or so my mother mentioned. 4 times. She mentioned it 4 times. 3 at dinner last week and once this morning at breakfast." Eleanor turned to look at him. He was still watching the room, but there was something in the set of his jaw, the slight tension of a man who has been patient for a long time and is running a quiet internal calculation about how much longer he intends to continue. "Nathaniel," she said quietly. He looked at her. "What happens tonight?" she asked. "What is she planning?" He held her gaze. "I don't know exactly," he said, "but I know my mother. She won't do anything unkind openly. She'll do something that looks like a compliment." Eleanor turned that over. "Something that positions me in a way that makes my position clear," she said slowly. "Yes." Without saying anything that can be objected to. "Yes." She looked back at the room. "All right," she said. "All right." He sounded for just a moment surprised. "I've been in this house for 3 weeks," Eleanor said. "I've organized every letter, every account, half the tenant correspondence, and this entire evening. If your mother wants to remind the room that I'm the hired help, she's going to have to work for it." He was quiet for a beat. Then, "Keep your hands still." Eleanor looked at him sharply. He was almost smiling. "Ida tells everyone that. She told me when I was 14 and terrified of my father's business partners. She was right." Eleanor laughed, a short, real one, surprised out of her. Nathaniel looked at her when she laughed. She caught it out of the corner of her eye, the way he looked, like something in the room had briefly stopped being complicated. Then someone called his name from across the hall, and the moment ended, and he went to be the heir of Caldwell Manor again, and Eleanor went back to watching the room with still hands. The first thing Margaret did was not what Eleanor expected. She was kind. That was the first move, and Eleanor almost missed it because she was watching for the other kind of trouble. Margaret moved through the room toward Eleanor near 9 o'clock. a woman from Richmond on her arm, and she smiled an actual, apparently genuine smile and said, "Miss Whitmore has been invaluable to us this past month. She has a remarkable gift for organization." The woman from Richmond looked at Eleanor with polite interest. "And a reverend's daughter, you said?" "Yes," Margaret said warmly. "She has helped enormously with the estate correspondence." Thomas always believed in finding capable people regardless of origin. A pause perfectly timed. He was very democratic that way. The woman smiled. Eleanor smiled. Margaret smiled. And everyone in hearing distance understood, without a single unkind word being spoken, exactly what Eleanor's function in this house was. Not guest, not equal. Staff. Competent, valued, appreciated staff. Eleanor kept her hands still. She excused herself gracefully when the conversation moved on and went to check on the supper room, which did not need checking, but gave her a reason to move. The second thing Margaret did was worse. Near 10 o'clock, as supper was being served, and the room had broken into the easy, comfortable fragments of 40 well-fed people in a beautiful house on a summer evening, Margaret arranged for Eleanor to be seated at the far end of the supper table. Not invisibly, she was present. She was included. There was nothing overtly wrong with the placement, but at the end, traditionally occupied by the house staff when they were invited to dine. Near the kitchen door, away from the center of conversation, and beside her, placed there with the thoughtfulness of a woman who had been planning social evenings for 30 years, was Albert the cousin, who was already mid-sentence about horse breeding before Eleanor had fully sat down. Eleanor ate her supper and listened to Albert and kept her expression attentive and her hands still. She was very tired, not of the evening, of the precision of it. The way every move was technically above reproach. The way Margaret could arrange an entire person's diminishment without saying a single word that could be challenged. She was halfway through her second course when she heard her name. "Miss Whitmore." She looked up. Margaret was standing at the center of the table, and the room had gone slightly quiet around her, the quiet that gathers when someone with authority speaks, and everyone nearby decides to pay attention. "I'd like to ask you something," Margaret said in the pleasant tone of a woman asking a perfectly reasonable question. "In your assessment, given your work with the estate records, what do you believe is the correct approach for the tenant agreements in the North Quarter? I've been telling Mr. Whitmore of Williamsburg about our situation, and I thought you might speak to it." Eleanor set down her fork. She understood what was happening. It was elegant, really, a public demonstration of Eleanor's function to be useful when called upon to speak, when asked to perform competence in a way that confirmed her place as the capable employee rather than the equal guest. She could answer quietly, briefly, stay in the role assigned to her. Or, she looked at Margaret. "The North Quarter agreements are complicated by the drainage issue on the Whitfield property," Eleanor said. Her voice was clear and steady. Not loud, but carrying. The conversations around her quieted further. "The current contracts hold the tenant family responsible for maintenance. They don't have the resources to address, which means the land is degrading without anyone being technically at fault. The practical solution is a renegotiation that splits the maintenance cost, but that requires reclassifying 3 of the agreements, which has some implications for the county records and will need Mr. Caldwell's signature." She paused. "I've drafted a proposal," she continued. "It's on the desk in the library if anyone would like to review it." Silence. Not the listening kind. The recalibrating kind. Mr. Whitmore of Williamsburg, a heavy-set man with sharp eyes who had been a land agent for 20 years, leaned forward slightly. "You drafted this yourself?" "Yes, sir." "Based on the estate records?" "And 2 conversations with Mr. James Whitfield about the on-ground situation." Mr. Whitmore looked at Margaret. "You have a capable woman here, Lady Margaret." "Yes," Margaret said. Her smile had not changed, but something in her eyes had. "She is remarkably capable." Eleanor picked up her fork. She had not won anything. She knew that. Margaret had not been embarrassed. She had been demonstrated to be correct. Miss Whitmore was indeed capable. The category had not been challenged, just made more impressive. But the room had heard Eleanor speak. The room had heard her be taken seriously. That was something. Across the long table, she caught Nathaniel's eyes. He was looking at her. He raised his glass very slightly, a motion so small it could have meant anything. His expression did not change. She looked back at her plate. Her heart was beating very fast. She ate her supper. The musicians started playing again in the ballroom, and people began to drift back toward the dancing. Albert resumed talking about horses. Eleanor listened and kept her face pleasant and tried not to think about the way Nathaniel had raised his glass. She was still trying not to think about it when 20 minutes later the evening took the turn that changed everything. She was near the edge of the ballroom watching the dancers when Charlotte appeared beside her. "You need to see something," Charlotte said quietly. "What is it?" "Not here." Charlotte's hand closed briefly around her wrist. "Come with me." Eleanor followed her through the hall and down the side corridor toward the small sitting room that she had been using occasionally for quiet work. Charlotte pushed the door open and went inside, and Eleanor followed her and Charlotte closed the door behind them. "What happened?" Eleanor asked. Charlotte turned. Her face was tight with something Eleanor couldn't immediately read. "My aunt has been talking to the Beaumont family," she said. "All evening. I thought it was the usual introduction. Let the families get to know each other. But I've been listening more carefully, and it's more than that." "More than what?" "She's made an arrangement." Charlotte said it like she was setting down something heavy. "With Mrs. Beaumont. About Nathaniel." Eleanor was very still. "What kind of arrangement? A formal one? Or the beginning of one?" Charlotte looked at her steadily. "She's offered to make the introduction official. A courtship proposal. Nathaniel to Harriet Beaumont announced before the end of the evening." Eleanor heard the words. She processed them. And then carefully she said, "Has Nathaniel agreed to this?" "He doesn't know." The room was quiet for a moment. "She arranged it without his knowledge?" Eleanor asked. "She arranged it because she believes—" Charlotte said carefully that he will refuse if asked directly. So she's presenting it as already decided, making the announcement and trusting that the public nature of it will guide his response. Eleanor turned away from Charlotte and faced the window. Outside, the sounds of the party continued. Music. Voices. The light sound of a woman laughing at something charming. "He told me," Eleanor said quietly, "that whatever happened tonight, he had already decided something." "Eleanor." Charlotte's voice was gentle in a way it hadn't been before. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." Eleanor turned back. "What is it between you and Nathaniel?" Charlotte asked. "Not what it should be, not what's proper. What is it?" Silence. "I don't know," Eleanor said. "Yes, you do." The words hung there. Eleanor had been in this house for 3 weeks. She had sat in the library for hours of careful, quiet company. She had walked fields in the late afternoon and listened to a man talk about wheat like it was something worth talking about. She had watched him hand a coin quietly to a tenant child without explaining why, and she had watched him argue with his mother at dinner and lose and accept it with grace, and she had watched him lift his glass across a supper table when she had held her ground. She knew what it was. She just hadn't said it, not even to herself, because saying it made it something that could be taken away. "It doesn't matter what it is," Eleanor said. "If she makes this announcement tonight, then we need to make sure she doesn't," Charlotte said. Eleanor looked at her. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," Charlotte said, "that you go find my cousin, right now, before my aunt gets to the center of that ballroom and says something in front of 40 people that he'll feel obligated to accept. I'm suggesting you tell him what I just told you and give him the chance to decide for himself. And if he decides in her favor," Charlotte was quiet a moment, "then you'll know," she said. And at least it was his choice and not his mother's arrangement. Eleanor pressed one hand flat against her skirt. "Still hands," Ida had said. She breathed out. "Where is he?" she asked. "Last I saw the East Hall, near the garden entrance." Eleanor moved toward the door. "Eleanor," Charlotte said. She stopped. "He's a good man," Charlotte said. "He's been a good man in a hard situation for 8 months. Don't—" She stopped, started again. "Don't let my aunt take this from either of you. That's all I'm saying." Eleanor nodded once. She went. The East Hall was thinner of people than the ballroom, a connecting corridor used mostly for movement between the dinner rooms and the garden, where a few guests had stepped out for air. Eleanor moved through it quickly, scanning as she went, and she almost missed him because he wasn't where Charlotte had said. He was outside, not in the formal garden, the side path, the narrow one between the stone wall and the kitchen herb beds where the torchlight from the house reached but barely. He was standing with his back to the wall and his face turned toward the dark, and from his posture, Eleanor understood immediately that he was not out here for air. He was out here to think. She had been out here for the same reason 2 nights ago. She crossed to him. He heard her coming and turned, and whatever he saw in her expression made him straighten. "What is it?" he said. "Your mother," Eleanor said. "She's made an arrangement with the Beaumont family. Harriet. A courtship announcement. Tonight." He was very still. "Without my knowledge," he said. "Not a question." "Charlotte only just told me." He said nothing for a moment. His jaw was set. His eyes were dark and unreadable. "I have to go back in," he said. "I know." He didn't move yet. "Nathaniel." Her voice came out quieter than she intended. "What you said to me last night about some things mattering more than what the room thinks, did you mean it?" He looked at her then, fully, directly, the way he looked at the ledger when he was making a final decision about something that couldn't be undone. "Yes," he said. "I meant it." She held his gaze. "Then go back inside and mean it where the room can see." He looked at her for one long moment. Then he straightened his jacket, and he walked back into the house. Eleanor waited 30 seconds. Then she followed. She came through the garden door into the corridor just in time to see it happening. Margaret was at the center of the ballroom. The musicians had stopped. 40 people were turned toward her with the attentive expressions of a crowd who understands they are about to witness a social event of some significance. Mrs. Beaumont stood at Margaret's right hand, Harriet at her side, perfectly composed, a small private smile on her face. Margaret was speaking. "And I am pleased to say that in the spirit of our family's long connection, and with the blessing of a mother's deepest hope for her son's happiness." "Mother." The voice came from the doorway. Nathaniel walked into the ballroom. He walked the way he always walked, unhurried, direct, taking up exactly the space he occupied and no more. But the room parted for him with the automatic respect of 40 people who understood instinctively that the center of gravity had just shifted. Margaret turned. The pleasant certainty in her expression flickered. Just once. Just briefly. "Nathaniel," she said. I know what you were doing." He stopped in the middle of the room, equidistant from everything. His voice was even. "I heard enough." The room was perfectly, completely silent. Mrs. Beaumont's smile had become uncertain. Harriet was looking at the floor. Margaret drew herself up. "You don't understand the full—" "Mother?" He said it the way he said everything important, without raising his voice, with the patience of a man who has learned that calm carries further than volume. "I'm grateful for what you've tried to do. I understand why. I know it comes from a place of real concern for this family and for my future." He paused. "But I am not an arrangement to be made." Margaret opened her mouth. "I am my father's son," Nathaniel said. "And my father believed that the most important things a man can choose are the ones he chooses himself." The silence stretched. "Miss Beaumont," Nathaniel said, and he turned to look at Harriet directly. His voice was kind. "You are a remarkable woman. Any man would be honored by your consideration. I mean no disrespect to you or your family." Harriet nodded, a single dignified nod. Her expression had settled into something composed and genuine. "And Mother," Nathaniel said, turning back, "I love you. I will always love you. But this—" He looked around the room, at the 40 people watching, at the candles and the crystal and the three musicians holding their instruments in the sudden silence. "This is not how I will make the most important decision of my life." He turned. He looked across the room. Eleanor was standing near the corridor entrance. She had not moved. She was aware in a dim and distant way that every person in the room had just followed Nathaniel's gaze and found her. She kept her hand still. Nathaniel crossed the room. He crossed it the way he had crossed the drawing room 3 weeks ago, unhurried, decided, with the simple certainty of a man who knows exactly what he's doing and has chosen to stop performing uncertainty about it. He stopped in front of her. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Caldwell," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "Nathaniel." "Nathaniel," she said. He extended his hand. "Would you honor me with this dance?" The room behind him was so quiet, Eleanor could hear the candles. She looked at his hand. She thought about marble floors and drawing rooms and letters with cold blue seals. She thought about wheat fields in late afternoon light and ledgers, and the way he had said, "The land tells you the truth." She thought about Charlotte's voice in the sitting room. "Don't let my aunt take this from either of you." And she thought about her father pressing her hands and saying, "Go with your whole heart." She thought about how afraid she was. She took his hand. "Yes," she said. He led her onto the floor. The musicians, after a beat of pure, suspended disbelief, began to play. They were not the only ones dancing. Within a minute, 2 other couples joined them on the floor, because that was what people did. They followed the shape of a moment. They let the music tell them what to do when the people around them were too surprised to know. But for the first 30 seconds, they were alone. And Nathaniel said very quietly, looking not at the room, but at her, "Are you all right?" She looked up at him. This close, she could see the tension that the room couldn't see, the set of his shoulders, the careful control of a man who has just done something significant in front of 40 people and is holding steady on the far side of it. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" He thought about it for a moment. An honest consideration, not a reflexive answer. "Ask me in an hour," he said. She almost laughed. "All right," she said. They danced. Behind them, she heard the room slowly, haltingly resume itself. The hum of conversation returning, the clink of glasses, the sound of people making sense of what they'd witnessed by the simplest available method, which was to begin discussing it quietly with whoever was standing closest to them. She did not look at Margaret. She did not need to. She already knew from the quality of the silence in the corner where Margaret stood that something had happened tonight that could not be walked back. Not a wound, not a defeat. Something more like a door closing on one version of the future, and another one beginning to take shape, still unclear, still unmapped, but real. She held Nathaniel's hand and moved through the music and kept her chin up. Later, much later, near midnight, when the guests had begun to leave and the servants were moving quietly to extinguish candles and clear glasses, Eleanor found herself in the library. She had not planned it. She had simply gone toward the room that felt most like her own in this house. And here she was, sitting in the chair by the south window, the room dark, except for the light coming from the hallway, her hands folded in her lap. She heard the door. Nathaniel came in and stood in the center of the room. "An hour has passed," Eleanor said. He sat down in the chair across from her. He was quiet for a long time. "She's not speaking to me," he said finally. "I know." She went upstairs without saying good night. "I know that too." Eleanor looked at him. "Nathaniel, she isn't wrong about everything." He glanced up. "She loves you," Eleanor said. "She's afraid for you. She's been holding this family together for 8 months by sheer force of will, and she doesn't trust anyone. She didn't choose herself." She paused. "She made a mistake tonight, but it came from a real place." He was quiet. "You don't have to defend her to me," he said. "I'm not defending her. I'm asking you to go talk to her before you sleep." He looked at her for a long moment. "Why?" he asked. "After what she did to you the drawing room tonight." "Because she's your mother," Eleanor said simply. "And because the kind of man who walks across a ballroom and makes a choice, that kind of man doesn't let his mother go to bed angry without trying." Silence. "You have very high expectations of me," Nathaniel said. "You've consistently met them," Eleanor said. He stood. He stood and looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read, too many things in it, layered and complicated in the way of a man who has spent a long time keeping his own counsel and is only slowly learning to let things show. "Eleanor," he said. She stilled at the sound of her name in his voice, without the title attached. "I don't know exactly what this is yet," he said. "Between us. I don't know what's possible or what's right or what I don't know the shape of it." She looked at him. "Neither do I," she said honestly. "But I know it's something." "Yes," she said. "It's something." He nodded once. "Good night, Miss Whitmore," he said. And then softer, "Eleanor." "Good night, Nathaniel." He left. She sat in the dark library for a long time after listening to the house settle around her, the distant sound of servants, the creak of old floors, the cooling air that came through the cracked window. Something had changed tonight. Not everything. Not enough. There were still 40 witnesses and a mother who had gone to bed in silence, and a county full of people who would be talking about what they had seen for weeks. There were still tenant agreements and estate records and a position that was formally that of hired secretary and nothing more. But something had changed. Eleanor pressed one hand flat against the arm of the chair and looked at the dark shelves around her. She thought about her father saying, "Go with your whole heart." She thought she finally understood what that cost. She thought she was beginning to understand why it was worth it. She got up, blew out the single candle on the reading table, and went to bed. Outside the window, the Virginia summer was all crickets and heat, and the smell of the wheat fields drying in the dark. And somewhere in this house, a man was knocking on his mother's door to say the things that needed to be said. And Eleanor Whitmore was learning very slowly what it meant to be in a place that might, against all reasonable expectation, one day become home. Margaret did not come down to breakfast. Eleanor knew before she reached the bottom of the stairs. She knew it the way you know certain things in a house, not because anyone tells you, but because the shape of the morning is different. Ida moved more quietly than usual at the stove. Mrs. Hartley's expression when she passed through the kitchen had the careful neutrality of someone who had already been spoken to and was not going to repeat what was said. Eleanor poured her coffee and sat at the small table by the window and did not ask. Nathaniel came through the kitchen door at 7, boots already on, coat over one arm. He stopped when he saw her. Something passed across his face, not quite relief, not quite discomfort, something more honest than either. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning." He poured himself coffee and remained standing, which was how he always started his mornings, moving before he was fully in the world, operating on the practical part of himself before the rest caught up. "She came out at 6, he said quietly. "We spoke for nearly an hour." Eleanor looked at him. How did it go? He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "She didn't apologize," he said. "I didn't ask her to, but she listened. She doesn't always do that." "What did you say to her?" He turned his coffee mug once in his hands. "I told her that Father's will wasn't an insult to her. It was a question he was asking all of us. Whether we could do better than we had been." He paused. "I told her I intended to answer it honestly, whatever that cost." "And what did she say?" "She said she didn't know if she could change." Eleanor held her coffee cup and looked at the garden through the window. The morning was already warm, the kind of Virginia summer warmth that arrived before the sun was properly up and didn't leave until well after dark. "That's an honest answer," Eleanor said. "Yes." He set his mug down. "It is." He left for the fields at 7:10. Eleanor stayed and finished her coffee and thought about a woman upstairs who did not know how to change, and a man who had gone out to work the land because the land at least told you the truth. She went to the library and opened the ledger and worked until 9. At 9:15, Margaret Caldwell walked through the door. Eleanor did not stand. She looked up, held Margaret's gaze, and waited. Margaret crossed to the chair on the other side of the desk, Nathaniel's chair. The one Eleanor had privately begun to think of that way, even though she knew she shouldn't, and she sat down. She folded her hands in her lap. Her back was straight. Her face was composed. But her eyes, Eleanor noticed, were tired in a way that good posture couldn't fix. "Miss Whitmore," Margaret said. "Lady Margaret." Silence. Margaret looked at the ledger open on the desk between them. Then she looked at Eleanor. "My son tells me you drafted a proposal for the North Quarter agreements." "Yes." "He says it is the most practical solution he's seen for the drainage issue." "It took some working out," Eleanor said carefully. "The records were complicated. He also says you spoke to James Whitfield directly, that you rode out to the South Cottages on a Tuesday afternoon and asked him about the situation on the ground." "I did." Eleanor kept her voice even. It seemed important to understand what the tenants were actually experiencing, rather than only what the records showed. Margaret was quiet for a moment. "That was Thomas's approach," she said. "My husband. He believed the ledger only told half the story." Eleanor said nothing. "I have been managing this estate's social affairs for 30 years, Margaret said. Her voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it that Eleanor had not heard there before, something that sounded like effort. "I know every family in 3 counties. I know their histories, their alliances, their debts. I know who can be trusted and who cannot, who has honor and who wears it like a costume." She paused. "What I have been less skilled at, perhaps, is understanding people who do not come with that context." Eleanor looked at her. "People like me," Eleanor said. "People like you," Margaret confirmed. She said it without flinching, which Eleanor respected. "People whose worth is not attached to a name I already know." The clock on the mantel ticked. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness," Margaret said. "I'm aware that the drawing room and last night are not things that are simply set aside." "No," Eleanor agreed. "They're not. I am telling you," Margaret continued, "that I am paying attention. That is perhaps all I can offer at present." It was not an apology. Eleanor had not expected one. But it was something real offered from a woman who did not traffic easily in vulnerability, and Eleanor understood enough about people to know that this had cost Margaret something. "I appreciate that," Eleanor said. Margaret stood. She started toward the door, then stopped. "The children," she said without turning around. "The ones Nathaniel mentioned. For the school." "Yes." "He said you were interested." "I am." A pause, long enough that Eleanor thought she might not continue. "My daughter," Margaret said, "died at 9 years old, before Nathaniel was born. She loved to read." She was still facing the door. "Thomas built the library for her. She died before it was finished." Eleanor sat very still. Margaret walked out. Eleanor looked at the empty doorway for a long time. Then she looked at the bookshelves around her floor-to-ceiling 4 walls, thousands of volumes in a library built for a little girl who never got to use it, and she felt something shift in her understanding of this house and the woman who ran it. She opened the ledger again, but her eyes didn't focus on the numbers for several minutes. The school became real the following week. Not a school in any formal sense, not yet. But Nathaniel had spoken to the families in the South and East Cottages, and there were 11 children between the ages of 6 and 14 who had no access to any kind of instruction, and a Tuesday afternoon was agreed upon, and Eleanor walked down to the Whitfield cottage with 3 books from the Caldwell Library under her arm, and found 11 children sitting on hay bales in the barn because the cottage was too small, and she thought, well, this is where it begins. James Whitfield stood at the back of the barn with his hat in his hands, watching. "You don't have to stay," Eleanor told him. "I know," he said. He didn't move. She started with reading. The oldest child, a girl named Ruth, 13, with the composed seriousness of someone who had been doing adult work since she was 8, could already read slowly, and Eleanor put her at the front and made her the assistant before the first session was 20 minutes old. Ruth straightened in a way that had nothing to do with her posture. By the time Eleanor walked back up the hill to the manor 2 hours later, she had ink on her right hand. a headache behind her eyes from the barn light, and something in her chest that she identified after a moment as the specific satisfaction of a thing being done right. Nathaniel was on the front steps. He'd been out since dawn, and it showed. He was dust-covered and squinting against the late afternoon sun, and he had the look of a man who had been waiting to ask something for a while. "How was it?" he said. "Ruth Whitfield is going to be extraordinary," Eleanor said. She read a full paragraph aloud and corrected my pronunciation of a word in the third line. She was right. Nathaniel almost smiled. "James Whitfield's daughter." "Yes. She has her father's stubbornness, and apparently her mother's precision." Eleanor stopped on the step below him. 11 children showed up. I was expecting 7. "Word travels fast in the cottages." "Apparently?" She looked up at him. "We're going to need more books." "I know." He said it like he had already decided it. "I spoke to a bookseller in Richmond last week. There's a shipment coming." She stared at him. "Last week," she repeated. "I was fairly confident you'd make it work," he said simply. There was nothing showy about it. He said it the way he said everything that mattered plainly, without decoration, as though it were simply a fact he had assessed and accepted. But it landed in Eleanor's chest with a weight that had nothing to do with books or children or tenant education. He had been so certain of her, before she had proven anything. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was quieter than she intended. He nodded once. "Go wash the ink off your hand." She looked down. The ink was in fact quite visible. She went inside. She washed her hands at the basin in the upstairs hallway and stood for a moment with the water running over her fingers and thought about certainty. About what it felt like to be believed in before you had earned it. About a man who had ordered books from Richmond before the first Tuesday session happened because he had looked at Eleanor Whitmore and simply decided she was capable of what she said she could do. She had not had that before. She had not known until this moment how much it cost not to have it. She pressed her wet hands against her face and breathed out. Then she went to the library and wrote the lesson plan for the following Tuesday. The letter arrived on a Thursday, 10 days after the gathering. It came from Richmond on official paper in a hand Eleanor did not recognize. It was addressed to Nathaniel. She set it on the library desk with the rest of the morning correspondence and thought nothing of it. But when Nathaniel came in at noon and saw it, something changed in his face, a stillness that was different from his usual stillness. Tighter. He read it twice. Then he set it down and looked at the window for a long moment. "What is it?" Eleanor asked. He turned the letter and slid it across the desk to her. She read it. It was from a solicitor in Richmond, a man named Alderton, representing a consortium of landowners in Harrow County. The letter was formal, precise, and deeply troubling. It outlined a legal challenge to the north quarter of the Caldwell estate, a claim of boundary dispute dating back 40 years, which had apparently lain dormant and was now being revived. The central argument was technical, but its practical implication was clear. If the claim succeeded, the Caldwells would lose approximately a third of their most productive farmland. 3 tenant families would be displaced. The Whitfield property, the one Eleanor had spent weeks working on an agreement for, sat directly in the contested area. She set the letter down. "When did this resurface?" she asked. "According to Alderton, the claim was filed 6 weeks ago." Nathaniel's voice was level in the way that meant he was actively managing something underneath. 3 weeks before you arrived." Eleanor looked at him. "Who is behind the consortium?" He was quiet. "Nathaniel. A man named Forsyth," he said. "Edward Forsyth. He owns the adjacent property to the north. He and my father had a disagreement, years ago, about water rights. It was resolved officially. But Forsyth is not a man who resolves things. He just waits. He waited for your father to die." The silence was its own answer. Eleanor looked back at the letter. She turned it over, read the second page. Her eyes moved quickly. She had learned the particular language of legal documents from the estate papers, and she was, as it turned out, reasonably good at finding the places where words were doing something other than what they appeared to be doing. "This reference," she said, pointing. "The boundary survey of 1789. He's claiming this as his primary evidence. Do you have the original? I don't know, Nathaniel said honestly. My father kept records of everything, but I haven't been through all the older files. Then that's where we start. She stood. The older files are in the storage room off the east corridor. The last door on the left, yes, but Eleanor, some of those boxes haven't been opened since my father organized them 15 years ago. Good, she said. Then no one has tampered with them. He looked at her for a moment. You don't have to do this, he said. It's not part of your position. The tenant agreement I drafted is worthless if the land it covers is lost, she said. It's very much part of my position. He didn't argue. They went to the storage room together. It took 3 hours. The boxes were dense with the accumulated paper of 40 years of careful record-keeping by a man who it became clear had trusted nothing to memory. Thomas Caldwell had documented everything. Letters, surveys, agreements, receipts, witnessed statements, notes in his own hand about conversations that had seemed important enough to record. Eleanor worked through the boxes methodically, while Nathaniel went through the filing cabinets, and they spoke occasionally to narrow the search to confirm what they were looking for, and otherwise the room was quiet, except for the sound of paper and the distant muffled noise of the house going about its afternoon. At 3:30, Eleanor found it. Here, she said. Nathaniel crossed to her. She held up a document, thick, slightly yellowed, the ink faded but legible. A boundary survey dated March 1791. Signed by 2 surveyors witnessed by 3 men whose names appeared in the county record, and attached this was the part attached to a letter from a county official confirming the survey as the binding legal document in any future dispute. Nathaniel took it from her hands and read it. The boundary described in the document was unambiguous. The Caldwell estate extended to the exact line that Forsyth was now challenging. There was no ambiguity. There was no gray area. The claim Forsyth had filed was based on a document that predated this survey, and this survey superseded it. He doesn't know we have this, Eleanor said, or he assumed we couldn't find it in time. Nathaniel's voice was still controlled, but something had shifted in it. A kind of weight coming off. The legal process has timelines. If we hadn't produced this within the response window... When is the response window? He checked the letter. 14 days from receipt. Eleanor counted backward. Thursday. We have 9 days. He looked at the survey in his hands, then at her. You found this? He said. You knew where the boxes were. Eleanor. Nathaniel. He held her gaze, and something in his expression was entirely unguarded in a way that she had not seen in him before. Not in the fields, not in the library, not even on the night of the gathering. He looked for one brief moment, like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time, and had just had some of the weight lifted without expecting it. Thank you, he said. She nodded. Get this to Alderton in Richmond by Monday. Give him enough time to prepare the formal response. He was already reaching for his coat. He left for Richmond the following morning. Eleanor did not sleep well that night, not because of the legal situation that at least was moving in the right direction, but because of the look on Nathaniel's face in the storage room, and because of something Charlotte had said weeks ago that Eleanor kept returning to, he'll choose correctly. The question is whether you can hold on until he does. She was beginning to understand what holding on required. It required standing still while things moved around you. It required organizing someone else's crisis with steady hands. It required sitting with the feeling of something growing between you and another person and not grabbing at it or rushing it or demanding that it be more defined than it was ready to be. It required, she thought, a particular kind of trust. Not in him exactly, in the thing itself, in the possibility that something real didn't need to be forced into a shape before it was ready. She was not naturally patient. She was learning. Nathaniel returned from Richmond on Sunday evening. He came into the house through the front door this time, rather than the kitchen, which Eleanor registered as different. She was in the library. She heard the door, heard Mrs. Hartley's quick greeting, heard his footsteps in the hall. He came to the library. He stood in the doorway. Alderton says we have a strong case, he said. I know. Eleanor set her pen down. How strong? He used the word decisive. A pause. He also asked where we found the 1791 survey. He said he's worked with the Caldwell estate for 15 years and he didn't know it existed. Your father kept very thorough records. He kept everything. Nathaniel came fully into the room and sat down. Not at his table. In the chair across from hers. He leaned back slightly, a rare relaxation of posture, and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Forsyth sent a message while I was in Richmond. He wants to negotiate. Eleanor's eyes sharpened. Before the formal response is filed, yes. He knows. He knows. Nathaniel looked back down at her. Or someone told him we'd found something he didn't expect. Do you want to negotiate? He thought about it. No, he said. I want him to know that we have the document and that we're filing the response and that this claim is over. I want it done. But I want it done cleanly, without... He stopped. Without what? Without becoming the kind of man who wins and then punishes. He said. My father never did that. Eleanor looked at him steadily. Then file the response, she said, and invite him to withdraw the claim before it's formally rejected. Give him the option to step back with some dignity. If he doesn't take it, that's his choice. Nathaniel looked at her. That is almost exactly what Alderton suggested. Alderton is a good solicitor. He also said, and I am repeating this because it is accurate, that the North Quarter proposal you drafted is the most sensible tenant framework he has seen for an estate of this size in 20 years of practice. Eleanor felt something warm move through her chest that she chose not to examine too closely. Tell him I found the model in your father's older correspondence, she said. He had the right instincts. I just formalized them. Nathaniel was quiet. Why do you do that? He asked. She looked up. Do what? Give the credit away. I'm not giving it away. I'm placing it correctly. You drafted that proposal. You spent 2 weeks on it. You interviewed the tenants. You cross-referenced 4 different legal frameworks. Based on your father's approach. Eleanor. His voice was quiet but firm. You can be capable and honest about it. Those aren't contradictory. She held his gaze. She did not have an immediate answer. He let her sit with that which she was learning was one of his particular skills. The willingness to ask a real question and then not fill the silence that followed it. Old habit, she said finally. My father's household was one where women offered ideas as suggestions and let the men adopt them as their own. It seemed easier. For them. Yes. Not for you. She said nothing. You don't have to do that here, he said. Simply. Plainly. As though it were a fact he was stating, rather than a gift he was offering. She looked at her hands. I'm still learning that, she said. I know, he said. I'm paying attention. He said it with the exact same words his mother had used. She wondered if he knew that. She wondered if he knew what it did to her to have the two of them so different, so difficult, so much more complicated than she had expected, using the same words to tell her the same thing. That she was being seen. That she mattered enough to look at. She picked up her pen. The Whitfield children need a reader for next Tuesday, she said. Ruth is ready to lead the younger ones, but she needs someone to work with her on the longer texts. I'll be there, Nathaniel said. She looked up. You don't have... I'll be there, he said again. He stood. He went to his table. He opened his ledger. They worked in the same room until the light faded and Mrs. Hartley called them to dinner, and neither of them said anything else that was personal or significant, or loaded with the weight of what was quietly inevitably becoming real between them. They didn't need to. It was in the room with them already, which was why when Eleanor came down to breakfast 4 days later and found Margaret in the kitchen, not the dining room, the kitchen sitting at the small table by the window where Eleanor always sat, she stopped in the doorway and did not immediately speak. Margaret had a cup of tea in front of her. She was wearing a dressing gown rather than her usual morning dress. She looked for the first time like a woman rather than a position. She looked at Eleanor in the doorway. "Sit down, Miss Whitmore," she said. "There's something I need to tell you." Eleanor sat. Margaret looked at her tea for a moment. Then she looked up. When Nathaniel was 17, she said he fell in love. A girl from the neighboring county. Pretty. Kind. I think genuinely kind. But her family had nothing. No land, no standing, no connections. She paused. I told him it was unsuitable. I told him that a man in his position couldn't afford that kind of... She stopped again. He listened to me. Eleanor waited. He did what I told him to do, Margaret said. He ended it. He was 17 years old and he loved that girl, and he ended it because I told him his position required it. Her voice was steady, controlled. But the steadiness was the kind that takes real effort to maintain. He never spoke of her again. He didn't stop being himself, but something closed, something I put there. Eleanor said nothing. He was 21 before I understood what I had done, Margaret said. And by then, it was too late to undo it, and I told myself it had been the right choice for the family, and I told myself that often enough that I started to believe it. She looked at Eleanor. I have been telling myself a great many things for a great many years. Eleanor held her gaze. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Because, Margaret said. And for the first time, her voice wavered just slightly. Just once. But Eleanor heard it. You are not that girl. You are not 17, and neither is he. And I am not going to tell him what I told him then. Eleanor felt something tighten in her throat. Lady Margaret, I am also not going to pretend, Margaret continued, recovering the steadiness, that I am entirely at peace with the situation. I am not a woman who changes quickly. I am not. She stopped. You will have to be patient with me. I can do that, Eleanor said quietly. I know you can. Margaret looked at her. That is the thing I find most alarming about you, Miss Whitmore. You are more patient than you have any reason to be. Eleanor almost smiled. My father's influence, she said. He sounds like a man worth knowing. He is? Silence. Margaret stood. She gathered her dressing gown. She moved toward the door with the particular dignity of a woman who has said a difficult thing and is now going to give everyone involved time to adjust to it. At the door, she paused. The school, she said. The children. Yes. I would like to contribute. Books, supplies, whatever is needed. A pause shorter this time. I have been thinking about my daughter. She left before Eleanor could respond. Eleanor sat at the small table and looked at the empty chair across from her and then out the window at the summer garden and thought about a library built for a little girl who never got to use it and a woman who had hardened herself into marble to survive the grief of it, and how sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was walk into a kitchen in a dressing gown and say the thing they had spent years not saying. She was still sitting there when Nathaniel came through the back door at 7 boots on coat over his arm. He stopped when he saw her face. What happened? He said. Your mother, Eleanor said. She was here this morning. He went still. What did she say? Eleanor looked at him. She told me about the girl you loved when you were 17, she said. The silence was complete. Nathaniel set his coat down on the counter very carefully. He did not look at her. He looked at the wall. She told you that, he said. Yes. A long pause. I haven't thought about that in... He stopped. Nathaniel. Eleanor waited until he looked at her. She's trying. She did a hard thing this morning. I just wanted you to know. He held her gaze. Something moved in his face, complicated and slow, the way things moved in him that were important. He was a man who processed things at depth and showed you the result rather than the process, and she had learned to watch for what the results looked like. She spoke to you about Catherine, he said quietly. If that was her name, yes. Catherine Marsh. He said it like a fact he'd learned to say without flinching. Dr. Marsh's niece. She moved to Georgia when she was 19. Eleanor waited. "I don't know what happened to her," he said. "I've never tried to find out. It seemed—" He exhaled. "She deserved better than someone who chose his family's expectations over her." "You were 17, Eleanor said, "and you did what your mother told you because you loved her, and you trusted her, and you were 17. "I know. You're not 17 now." He looked at her. The morning light was coming through the kitchen window at a sharp angle the way summer light did in Virginia, cutting across the room and landing on his face with the particular clarity that made everything look more itself. He was 33 years old, and he had been running this estate alone for 8 months, and he had stood in the middle of a ballroom and chosen her in front of 40 people. And he was standing in his kitchen, looking at her like she was something he was still figuring out whether he was allowed to want. "No," he said. "I'm not." Eleanor stood. She picked up her coffee cup. She looked at him steadily. "The books from Richmond arrived yesterday," she said. "I put them in the storage room. If you want to look through them before Tuesday, they're in the second box on the left." He looked at her. At the deliberate normalcy of it. At the way she had taken a charged moment and not pushed it further than it was ready to go. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. She walked past him toward the library. At the door she paused because something made her pause. Some instinct she didn't fully understand, and she looked back at him. He was watching her go. He had the expression of a man who had just seen something he wasn't sure he'd be allowed to have, and who was deciding very slowly that maybe he was allowed after all. She held his gaze for exactly 1 second, then she went to work. 3 days later, everything changed. Not slowly. Not with a warning. The way things changed in real life fast from a direction nobody expected, and with consequences that could not be undone. It started with a visitor. A man arrived at Caldwell Manor on a Wednesday morning in the 3rd week of August, unannounced, in a carriage that was expensive but not ostentatious. He gave his name to the door as Mr. Gerald Whitmore, Eleanor's brother. She had not told anyone he existed, not because she was hiding him, because he had never seemed relevant. Gerald was 4 years older than she was and had left the family home at 22 to pursue business interests in Philadelphia that had gone by general family understanding moderately well. He and Eleanor were not close. They had never been unkind to each other, but they occupied different frequencies. Gerald was ambitious in ways that their father gently disapproved of, and Eleanor had always been their father's child in a way Gerald resented, without quite being able to articulate. She found him in the front sitting room. He was standing when she entered, which was Gerald. He never sat when he could stand, never waited when he could move. "Eleanor." He smiled. It was a genuine smile, she thought. But behind it was something she recognized from childhood as Gerald's calculating face. "Gerald." She closed the door. "What are you doing here?" "Father wrote to me," he said. "He mentioned you'd taken a position with the Caldwell family. I was in Richmond on business and I thought I'd come by." "Father doesn't write to you." A small pause. "He wrote this time." She studied him. "What do you want, Gerald?" He spread his hands. "Can't a brother visit his sister? Not without a reason. Sit down." He sat. She remained standing, which was a reversal of their usual dynamic, and she could see him registering it. "The Caldwell estate," he said. "It's substantial. Everyone in Virginia knows the name." "Yes." "And you've been here, what, nearly 2 months?" 7 weeks. "And the heir—" "Stop," Eleanor said. Gerald stopped. "If you've come here because you think my position in this house can be turned into some kind of advantage for you," she said quietly, "you have misunderstood the situation completely." Gerald looked at her. "Eleanor, I'm not angry," she said. "I'm telling you plainly. Whatever you think is happening here, it is not something you can negotiate with or trade on. This household has treated me with more respect than I had a right to expect, and I will not have it compromised by—" "I heard about the gathering," Gerald said. She went still. "Word travels," he said, not unkindly. "Even to Richmond. A man named Caldwell danced with the Reverend's daughter in front of his entire social circle, and declined a match his mother had arranged. He looked at her steadily. "That is not nothing, Eleanor." She said nothing. "I'm not here to exploit anything," he said, and his voice dropped the performance, and became for a moment just Gerald, her brother 4 years older, who had also grown up in their father's house and learned the weight of being without advantages. "I'm here because I was in Richmond, and I heard that my sister was at the center of something significant, and I wanted to see it for myself." Eleanor looked at him for a long time. "Father really did write to you," she said. "He was worried. He said you weren't writing often enough." "I've been," she exhaled. "I've been very busy." "I know." Gerald looked around the room. "It shows from what I can see. The estate manager told me about the North Quarter situation. Apparently you found a document that saved the whole north boundary." "The document was in the family records." "But you found it." He looked back at her. "That is also not nothing." She sat down across from him. She looked at her brother. This man she had not known well enough to love easily, but knew too well to dismiss, and she thought about what it meant that he was here. About what it meant that the world outside this house was watching and talking, and forming opinions about Eleanor Whitmore that she had not asked for and could not entirely control. "You can stay for dinner," she said. His eyebrows rose slightly. "But if you say anything that makes this family uncomfortable, or makes me look like someone who brought her outside interests into this house, I will ask you to leave, and I will mean it." Gerald studied her. Then he said very quietly, "You're in love with him." Eleanor did not answer. "Eleanor, Gerald," she said calmly, "dinner is at 7. Mrs. Hartley will arrange a room if you want to stay the night. And if you bring up anything of a personal nature during dinner, I will not speak to you for a year." He was quiet for a moment. Then he laughed a short, genuine one, surprised out of him the way good laughs usually were. "God," he said, "Father's house made you something, didn't it? Go introduce yourself properly," she said, "and be exactly who you actually are, not who you think you need to be here. This household has very accurate instincts." She stood and went to the door. "Eleanor," Gerald said. She stopped. "For what it's worth," he said. "From what I've seen in the last 20 minutes, you belong here a great deal more than I would have thought possible 7 weeks ago." She looked at him. "That," she said, "is the nicest thing you've said to me since 1804. She left. And she stood for a moment in the hallway outside the sitting room, with her back to the closed door, one hand pressed flat against the wallpaper, and she thought about her brother's voice saying, "You're in love with him," with the calm matter-of-factness of someone identifying something obvious. She thought about what she had not said in response. She thought about what the silence had been in the space where a denial would have been. Then she straightened her back and went to find Mrs. Hartley to arrange the room, because there was work to be done, and there would always be work to be done, and Eleanor Whitmore had never once waited for the world to stop moving before she moved with it. But the question followed her through the rest of that day, like a shadow she couldn't walk ahead of, and it was still following her when at 9:30 that evening, after dinner was done and Gerald was settled, and the house was quiet, she went to the garden bench where she had sat 2 nights before the gathering, and she opened her father's Bible, and she didn't read a single word. She just sat and thought about what it meant to belong somewhere you hadn't been born to, and what it might cost, and whether it was worth it. She already knew the answer. She had known it since the night Nathaniel Caldwell stood in a ballroom full of silk and crystal and 40 witnesses and crossed the room to her like there was no other direction worth walking. She had known it then. She was only now letting herself say it, even just here in the dark with no one to hear, even just to herself. Gerald left the next morning. He shook Nathaniel's hand at the front door with the careful respect of a man taking accurate measure of someone and finding the measurement higher than expected. Nathaniel shook it back with the same careful directness he applied to everything. They exchanged perhaps 12 words. Both of them, Eleanor noticed, seemed satisfied by this. Gerald kissed her on the cheek before he climbed into the carriage. "Write to Father," he said quietly. "He worries." "I know. And Eleanor." He looked at her. Just looked for a moment with the particular expression of someone who has revised their understanding of a person and is still adjusting to the new version. Whatever this is, don't shrink from it. She didn't answer. He got in the carriage and left. She stood on the front steps until the carriage disappeared through the iron gates, and then she stood a moment longer, and then Nathaniel said from behind her, "He's a better man than he thinks he is." And she turned and found him already heading back inside, coat on, ready for the fields, already moving on to the next thing, in that way he had of treating sentiment as a thing you acknowledged, and then stepped past without lingering. "Yes," she said. "He is." She followed him inside, and went to the library, and opened the ledger, and was working within 4 minutes, because that was also she was realizing what she had in common with him. The ability to feel something real and then get back to work. It was not coldness. It was a different kind of care, the kind that expressed itself through function, through usefulness, through the quiet declaration that things mattered enough to tend to them properly. She was 2 hours into the morning correspondence when Mrs. Hartley came to the door with an expression Eleanor had not seen on her before. Careful, not alarmed, but careful in a specific way, like someone carrying something fragile. "There's a woman at the door," Mrs. Hartley said. "She says she has no appointment. She asked to speak with Lady Margaret." Eleanor looked up. "Who is she?" Mrs. Hartley paused in the particular way that meant the information was complicated. She gave her name as Mrs. Arthur Forsyth. The name landed like a stone into still water. Eleanor set her pen down. "Where is Lady Margaret?" "In the upstairs sitting room. She hasn't come down yet today." Mrs. Hartley looked at Eleanor with the expression of someone hoping to be told what to do. "I didn't know whether to admit her or—" "Admit her," Eleanor said. "Put her in the small sitting room off the east corridor. Tell her Lady Margaret will be with her shortly." She was already standing. "And send someone to find Mr. Caldwell." Mrs. Hartley left. Eleanor went upstairs. She knocked on Margaret's door, 3 quick, firm knocks, not tentative, and Margaret's voice came through still composed. "Come in." Eleanor opened the door. "Mrs. Edward Forsyth is downstairs. She's asking to see you." Margaret, who was sitting near the window with a letter in her hand, went very still. "Forsyth's wife," she said. "Yes?" A silence. "Did she say what she wants?" "No. She arrived without notice." Margaret set the letter down with the precise movement of someone buying herself 3 seconds of thought. Then she stood. She went to the mirror and straightened her cap without looking at Eleanor. "Have you told Nathaniel?" "I sent someone to find him." "Good." She turned. Her face was arranged back into the composed, controlled Margaret of the drawing room, but her eyes were working through something quickly. "This is not a social call." "No," Eleanor agreed. "I didn't think it was." Margaret looked at her. "Come with me," she said. Eleanor followed her downstairs. Mrs. Arthur Forsyth was perhaps 50, thin, neatly dressed, with the careful posture of a woman who had spent a long time managing herself in difficult circumstances. She stood when Margaret entered the room. She did not extend her hand. She looked at Margaret with an expression that was not hostile and not warm, but had in it the exhausted directness of someone who has decided to stop pretending. "Margaret," she said. "Clara," Margaret said. They had known each other a long time clearly. The first names without preamble said that. "Sit down." They sat. Eleanor stood near the door, not obtrusive, not prominently positioned, but present. Clara Forsyth glanced at her once, and then at Margaret. "Miss Whitmore manages our estate correspondence," Margaret said simply. "She stays." Clara accepted this with a small nod. Then she looked at her hands, which were folded in her lap. "Edward doesn't know I'm here," she said. Margaret waited. "He filed that claim," Clara said, "against the North Quarter. I know you know. I'm not here to defend it." "Why are you here?" Clara looked up. "To tell you that he's going to withdraw it." Silence. Margaret's expression did not change, but something shifted in her eyes. He told you this? No. A pause. I told him. Margaret looked at her. I told him, Clara said, that if he pursued that claim, I was going to go and live with my sister in Maryland, and I was not going to come back. She said it with the flatness of a woman who has made a decision so large that she's on the other side of the fear of it. He filed that claim without telling me. We have been adjacent to the Caldwell family for 40 years. Thomas Caldwell was at our wedding. Our children played together. Her voice did not waver, but Eleanor could hear the effort it took to keep it steady. This thing with the water rights that was between Thomas and Edward, and Thomas is gone, and I am not going to let my husband spend our remaining years turning an old grudge into a legal battle against his widow's son. A long silence. Clara, Margaret said carefully, if Edward withdraws, it has to be his choice, publicly, for it to hold. I know. Clara met her eyes. I'm telling you so you're prepared. He'll send a formal withdrawal to the solicitor in Richmond by the end of the week. He doesn't know I'm here, and he won't know I was here. She paused. But I needed you to know that this came from somewhere, that there are people in this county who remember what the Caldwell name means and want it to stay standing. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, Thank you. Clara nodded once. She stood. How are you managing? She said to Margaret. The question was different from everything before it, smaller, more human, stripped of all its formality. Since Thomas. Margaret was quiet for a beat. Better than I expected, she said. And worse than I let on. Clara looked at her. Something in the look was recognition. The particular recognition of women who understand each other's specific kinds of difficulty without needing it explained. Yes, Clara said. That sounds right. She left. Eleanor waited until the sound of the carriage was gone, and then she looked at Margaret. Margaret was still sitting in her chair. She was looking at the door Clara had gone through with an expression Eleanor had not seen on her before. Something that had been held tightly for a long time had loosened just slightly around the edges. She came here for you, Eleanor said quietly. Not for us. For you. I know, Margaret said. She thinks of you as a friend. I had forgotten, Margaret said, that people still did. She looked at Eleanor. When Thomas died, many of the friendships we had, the couples we socialized with, they fell away. It happens. People don't know what to do with a widow in a room full of marriages. They mean well, but they stop coming. She paused. I had forgotten that Clara was different. Eleanor said nothing. I have been, Margaret said slowly, very isolated, I think, for longer than I realized. Yes, Eleanor said. I think that's probably true. Margaret looked at her sharply. Not offended, just surprised. That Eleanor had agreed rather than softened it. You don't dissemble, Margaret said. Not if I can help it. I find that both irritating and useful. Eleanor almost smiled. I know. The corner of Margaret's mouth moved, just slightly, almost nothing. But Eleanor caught it. They were still sitting there when Nathaniel came through the door at a pace that suggested he had been walking quickly for the last several minutes. His eyes moved between them, taking in the room, reading whatever was in their faces, and then he stopped and said, What happened? Sit down, Margaret said. He sat. Eleanor told him. She was precise about it, what Clara had said, what Margaret had said, what the practical implication was for the legal situation. She did not editorialize. She gave him the facts in the order they had occurred. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Margaret. You didn't know she was coming. No. But you know her well enough that she came to you first, not to me. We are approximately the same age, Margaret said. We have known each other since we were girls. Nathaniel took that in. Mother, he said, have you been lonely? The question was so direct, so free of the usual social architecture that surrounded such things that Margaret blinked. Actually blinked. like someone who had been asked something in a language they hadn't expected. "Nathaniel, have you been lonely?" he said again, gentler this time. A long pause. "Yes," Margaret said. "I have been very lonely." The room was quiet. Eleanor looked at the window. She understood with the particular clarity that came from being outside a family while inside its house, that she was witnessing something that needed no witness, that what was happening between Nathaniel and his mother was years overdue and had nothing to do with her. She was here because she had been present when it started. She did not need to be present for the rest. "I'll tell Mrs. Hartley about the tea," she said quietly, and stood. Neither of them stopped her. She went out. She walked to the kitchen and told Ida not Mrs. Hartley, because Ida understood the kitchen and the sitting room and the space between them in a way that went beyond instruction. "The sitting room off the east corridor," Eleanor said. "Tea. The good set." Ida looked at her once. "For two?" Ida asked. "Yes," Eleanor said. "Just two." Ida put the kettle on without another word. Eleanor went to the library. She stood in the middle of it for a moment, surrounded by the books and the light and the smell of old paper, in a room that had been built for a dead girl, and she breathed in and breathed out and let the morning settle into its new shape. The legal threat was ending. Clara Forsythe had walked through a door she hadn't needed to open out of loyalty to a friendship she'd thought was dormant, and in doing so, had given Nathaniel back a third of his most productive land, and given Margaret back some small piece of herself. Things changed. Sometimes they changed because you pushed them, and sometimes they changed because a woman in a neat dress arrived without notice and told the truth. Eleanor sat down and opened the ledger. She had been working for 40 minutes when Nathaniel came in. He didn't say anything at first. He went to his table and set both hands flat on it and looked at the surface of it for a moment, and Eleanor could see on him the physical evidence of an emotional weight being redistributed, the slight release in his shoulders, the way his jaw was no longer held quite so tightly. "She cried," he said. Eleanor looked up. "Not much," he said. "My mother doesn't cry much, but she for a few minutes." He straightened. "She told me about a girl who used to come to visit when she was young, Clara Forsythe. They used to read together in her mother's garden. She hadn't thought about it in years." "People forget who they were," Eleanor said, "when they've been who they have to be for long enough." He looked at her. "Is that from your father?" "Probably." She tilted her head. "Or I read it somewhere. Either way." He sat down. He was quiet for a moment. "Alderton received Forsythe's formal withdrawal this morning. It came while I was in the field. Mrs. Hartley told me when I was halfway to the house." Eleanor's hands stilled over the ledger. "This morning," she said. "But Clara was just here." "He sent it before she came," Nathaniel said. "She came to tell us it was coming, but he had already sent it." Eleanor took that in. "He decided on his own," she said. "Or she told him last night, and he decided last night, and she still needed to come and tell us herself." He paused. "Either way, the claim is withdrawn. The North Quarter is ours. The Whitfield family is secure." He said the last sentence separately, distinctly, like it was the sentence that mattered most. Not the land. The family on it. Eleanor looked at him. "Your father would have done the same thing," she said. "Made sure the tenants were the part you named last." He was quiet. "I hope so," he said. "I'm still figuring out how to be what he was." "You are not what he was," Eleanor said. "You're what you are. That's enough." He held her gaze. Then he looked away and opened his own ledger, and Eleanor looked back at hers, and they worked. At 10 minutes to noon, Margaret appeared in the library doorway. This alone was remarkable. Eleanor had never seen Margaret come to the library voluntarily. It was Nathaniel's room, Eleanor's room. Margaret managed the house from the upstairs sitting room and the formal dining room and the spaces between. The library was not her territory. She stood in the doorway and looked at the two of them, at Nathaniel at his table, at Eleanor at hers, and Eleanor watched something cross her face that she couldn't quite name. Not approval, not exactly. Something older and more complicated. Something that had in it both grief and relief, the way things did when you finally saw something you had been refusing to look at. "Nathaniel," Margaret said, "I owe you an apology." He looked up. "The gathering," she said. "The arrangement with the Beaumonts." She was still in the doorway, still very straight. But her hands, Eleanor noticed, were not folded in their usual composed position. They were at her sides. "I did what I did out of fear. I told myself it was practical. It was not." A pause. "It was fear." Nathaniel looked at his mother steadily. "I know," he said. "I am going to try," Margaret said. Her voice did not break, but it worked not to. "To be better at learning what I don't know. That is the best I can offer." "It's enough," he said. "It's more than enough." Margaret nodded. She looked at Eleanor. Eleanor waited. "Miss Whitmore," Margaret said, "I owe you an apology that is longer and more specific and probably more difficult for me to give. I intend to give it." A pause. "Not today, because I believe I have already used the last of my available honesty for one morning. But soon." Eleanor said simply, "I know." Margaret's chin tilted up slightly, not defensively, with the particular posture of a woman who is surprised by a kindness and doesn't quite know how to carry it. "Yes," she said. "I suppose you do." She left. Nathaniel looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked back at him. Neither of them said anything, because nothing needed to be said. The room held it, all of it, the morning, and Clara Forsythe, and the legal withdrawal, and Margaret in the doorway. All of it. And it held them inside it, the two of them at their separate tables in a library, built for a girl who never got to grow up. Then Nathaniel said, "Are you free this afternoon?" Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "What does free mean in this context?" "It means the accounts can wait until tomorrow, and I want to show you something." She considered him. "All right," she said. He took her to the north quarter, not on horseback, on foot, along the path that ran behind the east cottages, and climbed slightly toward the ridge that marked the edge of the property. It was the hottest part of August now, the kind of heat that pressed down on everything and made even the air feel heavy, and by the time they reached the ridge, Eleanor had been grateful twice for the hat she'd taken from the hook by the kitchen door without asking anyone's permission. He stopped at the edge of the ridge and turned to look back. From here, you could see the whole of it, the manor house in the distance, its white face catching the afternoon light. The fields spread below in their different shades and textures. The lines of oak trees along the drive. The roof of the east cottages just visible through the tree line. The narrow path of the creek that ran along the boundary of the property. 40 years of work visible in one direction. "This is what the survey was for," Nathaniel said. "The 1791 document. This exact line. My father stood here with the surveyor and said, 'This is the edge of what I intend to build.'" Eleanor looked at the land. "He built more than he said he would," she said. "He always did." Nathaniel was quiet a moment. "This is the land Forsythe wanted to claim, from the northern edge of what you can see there down to the creek. 3 tenant families, 20 years of their work in the soil. And now it stays. And now it stays." He turned to look at her. "Because you spent a morning in a dusty storage room. Because your father kept meticulous records for 40 years. Eleanor." She looked at him. He was looking at her with the same expression from the storage room, that unguarded, weighty thing, but stronger now. More present. Like he had been building towards saying something all morning, and had finally decided this was the moment. "I need to tell you something," he said. Her heart did something inconvenient. "All right," she said. "When my father wrote that provision into his will, he said I was angry. I told you that. I thought he was being sentimental. I thought it was a condition designed to slow me down, to make me account for myself to someone outside the family." He looked at the land below them. "I spent the first month after the will was read resenting it. Quietly. Without telling anyone." Eleanor listened. "When your name came through, when my mother sent that letter, and your father sent the reference, I looked at your father's name and thought a preacher's daughter. Someone dutiful. Someone who would keep the records and not cause trouble and be gone in 2 years. He paused. I was not unkind in my thinking, but I was not seeing you. She waited. And then I came home that afternoon, he said, and you were on the floor of my mother's drawing room, and I looked at your face. He stopped. I looked at your face, and I saw someone who had decided not to break. Not someone who couldn't break. Someone who had chosen in that moment to hold something together inside herself that my mother was actively trying to take apart. Eleanor was very still. I knew then, he said, that I had been wrong about what my father was asking. The wind moved through the grass around them. The light was doing something particular to the fields below. Eleanor did not look at any of it. She looked at him. Nathaniel, she said carefully. What are you telling me? He looked at her directly. I'm telling you that I'm in love with you, he said, and that I have been for some time, and that I've been careful about saying it because I wanted to be sure I was saying it for the right reasons. Not because you found the document or organized the letters or taught the children or impressed Alderton. Because of who you are when none of that is happening. She could not speak. He continued, because now that he had started, he was apparently going to finish the way he finished everything, all the way through to the end. You defended my mother to me, he said. On the morning after she did the worst thing she has done to you. You told me to go talk to her before I slept. You didn't do that because it was strategically useful. You did it because you believed it was right. He paused. That is the person I'm in love with. The one who does the right thing when it costs her something. Eleanor pressed both hands flat against her skirt. Still hands. Ida's voice. Still hands say you're not afraid even when you are. She was afraid. Not of him. Of the size of this. The weight of something real being said out loud in the open air with no way to take it back. Nathaniel, she said. Her voice was steadier than she expected. I am a preacher's daughter from a small county with no land and no family name that opens any door in Virginia. I know what you are. I am telling you so. You've heard it said plainly. I have heard it said plenty, he said. By my mother, and by convention, and by the social machinery of this county for my entire adult life. I don't need to hear it from you. She looked at him. And I am telling you, he said quieter now, that I have also heard something else said plainly. By you. Every morning for 7 weeks. In the library and in the fields and in the kitchen at 7 in the morning with ink on your hand. He held her gaze. I have heard who you are, and I am asking you clearly, so there is no ambiguity whether there is any possibility that what I feel is something you also feel. The land stretched out below them. 40 years of work visible in one direction. The oak trees, the drive, the white house with its old brick face. Eleanor thought about her father pressing her hands, about the letter with the cold blue seal, about marble floors and a hand offered downward in a room full of silk and silver, about wheat fields and ledgers and books from Richmond ordered before the first lesson happened. She thought about her brother's voice. You're in love with him. She thought about the silence where a denial would have been. Yes, she said. There is that possibility. He looked at her. She looked back. There is more than a possibility, she said. If we are being plain. Something in his face changed. Not dramatically, he was not a dramatic man, but she saw it. The thing that had been held carefully managed, kept at the appropriate distance, it moved. Like a door opening into a room that had been shut for a long time. He reached out and took her hand. Not to lift her, not to lead her anywhere. Just to hold it there on the ridge with the Virginia summer pressing down on everything, and the land below them holding 40 years of other people's intentions. His hand was large and warm, and held hers with the same quality she had noticed in everything he did. No more pressure than was needed, no performance of it, just the solid, honest fact of it. They stood like that for a minute, maybe 2. All right, he said eventually. All right, she said. He did not let go of her hand on the walk back. They passed the east cottages and nodded to James Whitfield, who was working near the fence line, and looked up and saw them, and looked back down with the expression of a man minding his own business with tremendous deliberateness. They passed through the kitchen garden, and the herbs brushed Eleanor's sleeve, and she thought about her first morning here sitting at the small table, while Ida moved quietly at the stove and told her that Margaret was frightened rather than unkind. So much had happened in 7 weeks. At the kitchen door, Nathaniel let go of her hand. Not reluctantly, not with ceremony, just when the door needed to be opened. They went inside. And the house received them the way houses received things that had settled into their rightful place, without fanfare, without comment, just the ordinary sounds of an ordinary afternoon closing around something that had quietly finally come right. Eleanor went to the library. She sat at her desk and looked at the open ledger for a long time without seeing the numbers. Then she took a fresh sheet of paper. She wrote to her father. She had been writing to him in her head for weeks, drafts and revisions, and things she hadn't known how to say. Now the words came easily. She told him about the children and Ruth Whitfield, who would be extraordinary. She told him about the North Quarter and the document in the dusty box. She told him about Margaret in the kitchen in her dressing gown. She told him about Nathaniel. Not everything. Her father was a perceptive man. She didn't need to say everything. She said enough. She said, "I think I understand now what you meant, about going with your whole heart. I understand what it costs, and I understand why you said it anyway." She sealed the letter. She set it with the outgoing correspondence. She went back to the ledger. She worked until dinner, and at dinner, Margaret passed the bread to Eleanor before serving herself, which was such a small thing, and also not a small thing at all. And Nathaniel looked at his plate when it happened, and Eleanor looked at hers, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. The house was changing, not all at once, not without difficulty. These things didn't change all at once. Eleanor knew that had always known it. A house this old, a family, this set in its ways. A woman like Margaret, who had hardened herself for reasons that were real, even when the hardening itself had become the problem. But it was changing. She could feel it the way you felt a season changing not on any single day, but in the accumulation of days. The angle of the light, the temperature of the morning, the way the air smelled different coming through the window. Something was turning. It was almost the end of August now. And Eleanor Whitmore, who had arrived with one bag and a letter with a cold blue seal and a father's instruction to go with her, whole heart was beginning to understand what it meant to have done exactly that. She was still learning. She would be learning for a long time. But she was not afraid of what came next. She had stopped being afraid of it sometime between the ridge and the kitchen door, somewhere along the path where his hand had held hers, and neither of them had needed to say anything about it to know it was true. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, which was not a thing she had expected to feel about a house she had entered on her knees, and which was perhaps the most important thing her father had ever tried to teach her, that where you arrived was not always where you belonged. That belonging was not a condition you were born into or assigned. That it was something you built slowly with honesty and patience and the willingness to hold yourself together in the rooms that tried hardest to take you apart. Eleanor closed the ledger. She stood. She walked to the window and looked out at the August dark at the fireflies in the kitchen garden, and the heat still present in the air, and the particular quiet of a Virginia summer night that had nothing left to prove. She thought tomorrow there are letters to write, and children to teach, and accounts to balance, and a woman who is slowly, painfully, genuinely trying to be different than she has been. She thought this is enough. She thought this is more than enough. And somewhere in the house, she heard footsteps in the library, familiar, measured moving, with the unhurried certainty of someone who had nowhere else to be, and she smiled at the window and didn't say anything and didn't need to. He was there. She was here. The house held both of them, and tomorrow was coming the way it always did, with its ordinary weight and its ordinary grace, and all the specific, unremarkable beauty of a life being lived without apology in exactly the place it was meant to be. September came in quietly. The heat broke on the 3rd day of the month, not dramatically, not with storms, Just a slow release, like something that had been held too long finally letting go. Eleanor noticed it first in the kitchen garden at dawn, the air carrying a different weight, and she stood there for a moment with her coffee and thought everything changes. Even the things that seem permanent. Even Virginia summers. Ruth Whitfield read aloud to the younger children that Tuesday without Eleanor prompting her. She simply stood up, took the book from the table, and began. Her voice was steady. Her pronunciation was correct. When 6-year-old Thomas Greer lost his place, she waited not impatiently, not with the condescension that older children sometimes carried toward younger ones. She just waited and pointed to the line and said, "Start here," and he did. Eleanor stood at the back of the barn and watched and did not say a word. James Whitfield was there again at the back wall, hat in his hands. He caught Eleanor's eye across the room. He nodded once. She nodded back. That was all. That was everything. She was walking back up the hill when she heard hoofbeats behind her and turned to find Nathaniel coming down the path on horseback, which meant he had ridden out to meet her, which meant he had known when to come, which meant he had been paying attention to what time she usually finished on Tuesdays. She noted all of this without saying any of it. He pulled up beside her. "How was it?" "Ruth led the session," Eleanor said. "I didn't have to say a word for the first 20 minutes. He looked at her. "You look like you've just watched something important happen." "I have," she said. "That girl is going to change things, not just for herself, for everyone who comes after her." He was quiet for a moment. "My father used to say that education was the only inheritance that couldn't be taken away." He was right. Nathaniel dismounted and walked beside her leading the horse, and neither of them spoke for a while. The path was familiar now. She knew every turn of it, every tree root that crossed the dirt, the exact place where the light came through the branches at a particular angle in the morning. She had been here long enough for the land to have learned her back. "I spoke to Alderton yesterday," Nathaniel said. "The withdrawal is complete, filed and confirmed. The North Quarter is fully ours." "I know. Mrs. Hartley told me." "She told you before I could." "She tells me most things before you can," Eleanor said. "She finds it efficient." He made a sound that was nearly a laugh. They reached the top of the hill where the path widened and the manor came into view. They stopped without planning to the way they sometimes stopped at this particular spot, because the view from here asked you to pause. "I want to ask you something," Nathaniel said. Eleanor looked at him. He was looking at the house. "My father's provision in the will, the 2-year term, it ends in June." She said nothing. "I want you to know," he said, still looking at the house, "that whatever you decide about June, whether you stay or whether you go, it won't be because I've made you feel you had no choice." He turned to look at her then. "I'm not my mother. I won't arrange things and present them as already decided. I'm asking you plainly. When June comes, what do you want?" Eleanor held his gaze. "I want," she said carefully, "to see Ruth Whitfield read an entire book cover to cover." He waited. "I want to finish the North Quarter agreement and have it witnessed and filed properly." She paused. "I want to watch your mother have tea with Clara Forsyth, which I believe is going to happen, and which I believe is going to be good for both of them." He was very still. "And I want," Eleanor said, "to be here when all of that happens." The word "here" landed between them, with all the weight she had put into it. He looked at her for a long moment. "Then stay," he said. Simply, without ceremony. The way he said everything that mattered. "I'm staying," she said. They walked back to the house together. That afternoon, Margaret came to the library, not with the careful, constructed composure of before. She came in wearing a slightly rumpled house dress and carrying a letter she had apparently just received, and she sat down across from Eleanor without ceremony and said, "Clara is coming to call on Friday. I told her yes, before I thought about whether I had the courage for it." Eleanor set her pen down. "Do you?" "I have no idea," Margaret said. "But I said yes, so now I have to." She looked at the letter. "We used to be very close. before I became what I became. A pause. I'm not sure how much of her I'll know anymore. You'll know more than you think, Eleanor said. People like you two, the friendship is still there. It's just been waiting. Margaret looked at her sharply. How can you possibly know that? Because she drove a carriage to your door without an appointment, Eleanor said. People only do that for people who matter. Margaret was quiet. Then she said unexpectedly, My daughter would have liked you. The words arrived without warning and landed somewhere deep. Eleanor did not rush to fill the silence. She let it be what it was. Tell me about her, Eleanor said. Margaret looked at her hands. And then for the next hour she did. She talked about a girl named Anne, who had loved the library before it was built, who had asked questions that no one knew how to answer, who had been too much herself for a world that wanted little girls to be decorative and quiet. She talked about her the way you talk about someone when you've been keeping them inside for a long time all at once, with the particular relief of letting something out of a closed room. Eleanor listened. She did not take notes. She did not offer solutions. She listened, the way her father had always listened, with her whole self, without looking at the window, without waiting for her turn. When Margaret finished, she was very still. I haven't spoken about her like that, she said, since Thomas died. I know, Eleanor said gently. Margaret looked at her. You're going to be insufferable to live with, she said. You see everything. Eleanor said, I learned from someone who saw everything first. Margaret understood she meant her father. Her expression shifted into something that was not quite warmth, but was moving toward it, the way a frozen river moves in early spring, slowly with resistance, but inevitably. Well, Margaret said, standing, I suppose that's something. She left. Eleanor sat alone in the library. Outside she could hear the ordinary sounds of the house, Ida in the kitchen, a door somewhere upstairs, the far-off voice of one of the stable boys. The sounds of a household that had been here for 40 years and intended to be here for 40 more. She thought about a marble floor in July, about a hand offered downward, about the specific clean feeling of being lifted by someone who had decided without being asked that you deserved to be standing. She thought about Ruth Whitfield's voice reading aloud in a barn. She thought about Margaret talking about Anne for the first time in 8 months. She thought about Nathaniel on the ridge saying, I'm telling you that I'm in love with you, with the same direct plainness he used for everything. Ledger entries, tenant agreements, things that were simply true and needed to be said. She thought about her father's instruction, go with your whole heart. She had. She had gone with everything she had, and it had cost her something. The ease of a simpler life, the safety of smaller expectations, the comfort of knowing exactly what was being asked of her. It had cost her the floor of a drawing room, and 8 women watching, and a county full of people deciding what she was before she could say it herself. It had given her this, a library built for a dead girl full of books full of light, a woman learning to soften, a man who told the truth plainly and held her hand on the ridge and ordered books from Richmond before she had proved she deserved them. 11 children on hay bales learning to read, a future that was not the one she had arrived with and was entirely, unmistakably hers. Eleanor Grace Whitmore picked up her pen. She had letters to write, and accounts to balance, and a Tuesday lesson to plan, and a life to live in a place she had entered on her knees, and would leave someday, having stood in it fully upright, unhidden, and entirely herself. She put the pen to paper. She began. And in Caldwell Manor, on an early September morning in 1812, something that had been broken for a long time quietly, steadily finished becoming whole.